That includes backup slides, Bob. We have fewer slides to present depending on the number of questions.
Okay. So we do have a comprehensive presentation on all things related to clean energy. And with that, I will allow Mr. Stevenson to be your tour director for the evening.
Well, thank you. Then we'll get right into it because we've got a lot of very interesting material to cover tonight. So we're really looking forward to it. But before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the staff and number of folks that have worked hard to prepare for this evening, but also deal with a lot of material that we're going to cover on a regular basis. And just to point out a few names, Shane Oneski, you might recall Shane's involvement in this topic in the past, having presented a number of alternatives to the board in 2016. Sean O'Reilly is an engineer in our development group, and he's the project manager for much of the work that we'll talk about tonight. Thomas Spankowski deals with a lot of regulatory compliance issues. Dan Stevenson, no relation, our facilities that we know of, facilities maintenance manager, who's a part of our project team as well, and will be sharing some information with the board tonight. Sydney Ohm over in the back there from our finance department, part of the team as well, and contributed to the project. So there's a lot of work went into not only materials that we'll be sharing, but also the topics that we'll talk about tonight. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll just mention that what we'll cover, we'll see this agenda a few times tonight. But what we'd like to do is just provide a general overview, a broad overview of sort of staff's view of energy management at ACWD, and also talk about, also talk about energy efficiency programs and initiatives that we conduct routinely. Also talk about our clean energy generation and infrastructure planning. This will be going back to some of the material that we looked at in 2016 and then an update that we've done recently. And then also talk about conclusions and our approach to next steps so we can get the board's thoughts about where we're headed. And I would just mention that yes, we have a lot of material to cover, but feel free, board or public, to stop us at any time, ask questions, and we'll let you know if we're going to cover that material in a future slide. So just to take a quick look at the overall context, essentially staff sees energy management at ACWD as sort of multi-pronged. That it involves optimizing our operation for maximum energy efficiency and conservation, participating in initiatives to maximize the value we get out of energy and minimize our costs. And then also in terms of prior board guidance, the sort of direction staff works to achieve is minimizing costs. It's a big factor in terms of overall energy. You'll see some more about that tonight. And also doing what we can to reduce our energy consumption and GHG gas emissions. And then in terms of overall board strategic objectives, you may remember that strategic goal 1 is cost effectiveness and value, and that includes a specific strategic objective related to renewable energy. You can see an excerpt from our strategic plan here at the bottom of the slide showing specific installations. Those are solar, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But before we do, we'll get a bit of some additional background from the other Mr. Stevenson related to our operational initiatives and programs focused on energy efficiency and conservation. Thank you, Ed. You're going to see us kind of doing some, we'll get our exercise tonight, even if you don't.
So, good evening, honorable, or afternoon, I guess it is, honorable board and staff and public. My name is Dan Stevenson, as Ed mentioned. I'm the Facilities Maintenance Division Manager. And my role here is to talk about some of the energy conservation and some of the initiatives that we do, the programs that we do. Directors Akbari and Huang have seen a version of this at one of the committee meetings back in November, December, something like that. But it's been updated and there's a few new things, so hopefully it won't be too repetitive. So what we're going to do is talk about a little background. So what I want to do is, there's so many programs that we're involved with. I want to give just a 30,000-foot overview. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of pieces to them. They're kind of convoluted and complex, so we get lost in them. Pretty acronym heavy. Our main goal with all these things are to reduce our energy use, be good environmental stewards, and ultimately save money. it's doing that. So the district's power budgets are housed in the Facilities Maintenance Division budget, so that falls under my purview. We have 77 separate PG&E accounts. Some are big, like for this building, and some are real small, like cathodic detection station, somewhere for $6. The current year's budget is $3.7 million, and which is a pretty big chunk of our operations and maintenance department overall operating expense budget. It's about $74 million, so it's roughly about 5%. So this is something that we want to see where we can make reductions and save money where we can. It's doing this. So there's a list of a bunch of the PG&E programs that we're involved with. I'm going to go through each one of those, so we don't need to get hung up on that. But one thing I do want to mention here is that we do have a PG&E government accounts representative who I meet with regularly, and somebody on my staff. We have an electrical engineer's position is currently vacant, but I have an electrical engineer and F&B staff that regularly reviews the bills and meets the rec as well. So hopefully we have positions filled soon. And the way I've structured this is I want to talk about some of the PG&E programs that we're involved with, and then there's another half where we talk about some of the internal changes that we've made, some operational changes that we've made in order to save money. So I'm going to cover these items as well. So first up of our PG&E programs is PDP, peak day pricing. And what peak day pricing is PG&E can call up to 15 events between May and October. That's our peak day pricing season, as we call it. And what that means is they get us a day in advance notification, and we reduce the power in the building from 2 to 6 p.m. We have PG&E came installed a little black box in our electrical room that gives the internet signal, so it sort of does all the preloaded in there, so it kind of automatically does it. Bottom line with that program, we started it in 2010, and we saved about $4,500 a year. We average about 12 events a year, so just for fun, we put on there, it's about $300 per event that we go through. Next up is RESPECT. I don't know if that's the official title of it, but that's how we refer to it. And that acronym, I never remember it. It is Renewable Energy Self-Generation Bill Credit Transfer. And that was born of an assembly bill. And really what that means is if any municipality that generates excess green power that feeds it back to the grid, you can get offsetting credits at other facilities that you designate those credits to go toward. So in our case, we have treatment plant number 2 that has hydro turbines in it. So we take advantage of the water that comes off the South Bay Aqueduct, the raw water supply. It turns a series of hydro turbines. And it powers not only treatment plant number 1, but Mission San Jose Water Treatment Plant is also connected. Even though it's not a functioning plant, we still have power demands there, and we have equipment that we operate. We also have booster station 16, B16, which is on site at treatment plant number 2. So it powers all of those things, plus we send some money back into the grid, or I'm sorry, we send some power back in the grid, which gets us money. And this is a relatively new program for us. We shortly after I came on board in 2017, we started working with PG&E. It required that we did some equipment upgrades last year at this time for when we were at our treatment plant 2 shutdown. So we had to put some relays, do some protective equipment, some seismic retrofit, and then we began to realize these savings.
I have a question there.
Yes, sir.
My understanding was that at TP2, the hydro energy was satisfying all of the energy demand at that site.
Correct.
So is this in excess of satisfying the
Correct.
energy requirements of TP2?
Correct. So the hydro turbines generate enough power to power TP2, TP1, and B16, and then they generate excess that we put into the grid.
Okay.
So, and then the valuation of that excess that we put into the grid is shown here on this chart. So this is where we get the offsetting dollar for dollar credits.
Mm-hmm.
Just for TP2, we break even at around 10 MGD. So when we're at production rates above 10 MGD, we're exporting power.
But when
Yeah.
TB2 is shut down, there's no
So-
power.
Correct.
Yes, that's
So this
correct.
150 is for the periods of time that we're operating TB2 above 10 MG,
Correct.
which is relatively short time, so that's interesting.
So here's the 2018 saving. You'll see last year when we were shut down, so you got your month there that we didn't receive any offsetting credits. But that's the dollar value, so we're pretty happy with that. That's a full year's worth of data. Next up is EBCE, which is the East Bay Community Energy. If you live in the East Bay, you're familiar that this came. They roll out the residential program later in the year, but they rolled it out for commercial industrial in June, so we were automatically enrolled. What this does is they give you a 1.5% discount on your power. However, there's a couple of caveats with this. The RESPECT accounts that we have, so TP2 and all the other facilities that we designated to receive those offsetting credits are not eligible because you can't double dip. And the small note there is the CPUC later last year, ruled that PG&E can add a 1.68% surcharge on the EBCE accounts. I talked to my PG&E account rep last week. He said they haven't enacted that, but it's likely coming soon. So when they do that, we'll review that and see if we want, because obviously there's going to be a net 0.18% loss. So we'll review those accounts and see if we're going to opt out at that point. See what it looks like.
So let me just try to clear this up in my mind. I went through the presentation and saw this. The community energy group was providing us with a discount, residents as well.
Yes.
And now PG&E is authorized to make that all up, back, and more, creating a disincentive to join.
So well, I'm not sure exactly how. So the CPUC ruled. PG&E went to the CPUC and said, well, there's 19 aggregators across the state. They said, hey, these aggregators are coming in and incurring us, and we incur some fees for that. So my understanding is the CPUC allowed PG&E to come in with other fees. I don't know exactly what those fees are, but it amounts to 1.68%. So I think it has to do with transmission, and did I have this right?
Yeah, so the charge is as a result of community choice aggregation customers departing PG&E. PG&E has purchased power on behalf of these departed customers and has to basically make up for those additional power that they no longer need because customers have left their customer base. And so the CPUC has authorized PG&E and the other IOUs, investor-owned utilities, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, to be able to recover these charges from customers that have departed. In all likelihood, the community choice aggregation organizations such as EBCE are going to lower the rate in response to that applied 1.68% because their whole existence relies on being able to deliver energy.
Well, that's what happened when I received the invitation to join our local community aggregator. And that was part of the incentive. Part was also that you want to go green as much as possible.
Right.
You might be willing to pay a premium to go in that direction. But it seems like contradiction here in the sales that was made to the public, the community.
I think that additional charge that PG&E is authorized to place on customers was done after the community choice aggregators had rolled out the program, and so now they're going to have an opportunity to adjust to that change in the market price. And so from working with community choice aggregation organizations, their response is to lower their prices to maintain that customer.
It's still going to pay the bill. So
What a silly game.
A zero, yeah, exactly. It's a zero-sum game. How much money are we talking about?
In all total, I don't have that. I don't have that figure. We just our largest power consumption accounts for the district are associated with RESPEC. So some of these are going to be
So this is marginal power use consumption in our district.
It would be no more than $50,000 based on 3.7 million.
No,
much less
Yeah,
than
if you're
that.
looking at the total number. Yeah, I'm saying it couldn't be any more than that.
we in the back table we factored it was roughly $15,000.
15,000 a year. Okay.
And maybe I'll just mention real quick, you heard from Ryan Ramos, who I hadn't introduced yet because our consultant team is coming up, but I might as well just let you know who you're hearing from because I invite Ryan and Michael to participate as needed. Ryan Ramos, technical consultant for Michael D. Brown Engineering, and next to him is Michael Brown, and I'll introduce them a little bit more coming up, but that way you know who you're talking to. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it. These guys are the technical experts here on this stuff.
So I just wanted to add something, you can clarify for my benefit. If we're part of if we have certain accounts that are associated with respect, we're not allowed to have those same accounts be a part of the community aggregator. Is that correct?
Correct. Respect accounts are not eligible for being part of EBC.
Okay. I just want to make sure that was understood.
Next up, LED lighting retrofit project. So, board approved us to enter agreement with the consultant to do lighting retrofit at TP1, TP2, desal, blender, and headquarters facilities. So that's about a $250,000 project, qualified for about $10,000 of rebates. One of the cool parts of one of the cool features of the project was that it has on-bill financing, which is sort of a loan package that PG&E offers where they essentially pay for the project and we continue to pay our PG&E bill until the equipment's paid off, and then at that point we own it. And so there's no upfront out-of-pocket costs. There's no interest, no fee loan, if you will. So we're going to save about about $80,000 in energy just by changing out lights. And one of the other benefits, as I mentioned, ResPecs will be offsetting credits, so the energy saved with the lights at TP1 and TP2 will feed back into ResPec and get our offsetting credits elsewhere. Facilities energy assessment. So this is another program that PG&E offers. So last summer we engaged PG&E on this. It took the better part of a week. What this means is we went around with the PG&E. They provided an electrical engineer. We had some of our staff. I actually spent a day with them. We went around different facilities and they looked at whether there's equipment or there's pumps or other energy using devices that we might be able to find something that uses less, and then they want to couple that with some incentives that they have. So they provided us, I just got this about 3 weeks ago, they provided us the following report. So this is very preliminary, so let me stress that because we just got this, we haven't vetted it. We want to go through this, see what this is based on, but I just thought I would share this because this is kind of hot off the presses, so it's like I said, it's about 3 weeks old. We haven't gone through it. As you can see, item number 1 there we're already doing. Items number 5 and 6 they have a pretty large upfront cost and they're pretty large projects. But one of the things and why I say that we want to make sure that we review this is item number 6 there potentially has additional costs because this is to install VFDs, which are variable frequency drives, and these are pretty big units, about the size of a refrigerator. We have the space at Maori Wellfield, but for example, why we're concerned about some ancillary costs is Gulf of Tyson we might need to build another structure or something to house these things. So there might be other costs that might make some of this prohibitive. But we're pretty excited about this one. We want to look through these items. I know it doesn't seem like a lot. I asked our PG&E representative, I said, wow, we spent a whole week and we only came up with 6 items. They said, well, you guys are pretty lucky. We only find 1 or 2 of most people that we visit.
Is there any reason why they didn't find anything at our desal plant for cost savings?
I don't know. They did look at desal, and there's nothing in here. They didn't put anything in the report.
We currently have variable speed drive pumps at the desal facility, so I suspect that's why.
And energy recovery turbines as well.
Correct.
Yeah, so the equipment's probably up to date. Yeah, good point. Demand response, DR program. So there's a few different types of demand response programs, but this works essentially, in theory or in application, it works how I mentioned the PDP, which is the first one, which they call certain event days, and then we agreed to shift a certain load during those event days. Only with demand response, with PDP they pay us, or we pay a lower rate during the period to be part of PDP. With demand response, they pay us per event to shed those loads. So this one is really, really hot off the presses. I just got a proposal from the aggregator I've been talking to, and we stand to save about $13,000, and so that was pretty good for us. So I'm going to work with Pat Miyake on finalizing that agreement because I intend to move forward with that. So we might, if all goes well, we should be able to join that in July. So.
And I just want to add, With respect to these kinds of programs, we're taking them in baby steps because we have a primary responsibility to provide water to our public, so we don't want to be turning off our facilities willy-nilly. So we just want to get our toe into the water first, see how these programs operate, see how we can accommodate with the requirements on when we can or must shed load. So we're taking it slow and cautiously. I just wanted to emphasize that.
Sure, I'll tag on to that because I know what he's getting at. So when I first talked to the aggregator, I went, oh yeah, we can shut everything. We'll shut off desal, we'll shut off, and then it gave us this large number. Oh yeah, hey, you can save all this money. And then when I went to our production folks, they're like, hey, water quality issues, we got, and I went, okay, well, let's back off. So that was good though. We had that conversation, we were regrouped, and the $13,000 seems something that we could do. And then we can always add to it later. They do an annual enrollment, so if we get comfortable, we want to add more capacity. APEP, this is Advanced Pump Efficiency Program. This is a program that PG&E offers to provide incentives, rebates and that kind of thing for larger pumps, so any pumps greater than 30 horsepower. If we remember back to our energy assessment, line number 4 there is APEP pump overhauls. So meaning my Facilities Maintenance Division, we do, every 3 years we go through and we do pump efficiency testing. So this is actually our 3rd year, so we'll be doing this. This will be my first time doing it. So we're going to go through, but we're going to do that in conjunction with PG&E this year. So hopefully if we find anything out there that PG&E will connect us with some incentives, we'll be able to either rehab or replace pumps with each PG&E providing some incentives and subsidizing some loan. So that's it for the PG&E programs. So some of the internal operational changes that we've made to make adjustments. After I started here, I started having conversations with our production division, and we started talking about some energy usage. So some of the things that we came up with, and we started talking about time of use. I got time of use pumping on there, but it's really time of use with energy costs different. There's different pricing structure for energy during different times. That's particularly May to October. So basically from noon to 6 p.m. you're at this on peak. That's bookended by a few hours of what they call partial peak, and then the rest of it's off peak. So you want to try to use your energy as much as you can in the off peak times. So in talking with production staff, we talked about, well, what are some changes that we can do? And this is really kind of their wheelhouse, but we talked about some different things. So one of the things they do is they manipulate the system and move water in such a fashion that to maximize using or optimize those that off-peak time. So they change the blender rates a little bit during those peak times, take advantage of storage. And one simple thing that came out of that is we just changed how we sample wells. They need to take water quality samples at the wells, and previously what would happen is it was just part of a route that a field operator in the field went and did. Now they do it at 7 a.m. within the off-peak time to avoid being on that peak or the partial peak time. So we haven't quantified that, so I didn't take credit for that, but we know we're getting something there. And to kind of continue on that same idea, we talked about, and this is totally their wheelhouse, but doing some flow through at Winfield. So the way that they can manage the Winfield Reservoir, so the effluent from TP2 flows down to the Winfield Reservoir, and then it goes into Zone 1 and Zone 2, but we're talking primarily about Zone 1. So they can manipulate the reservoir in a way that during the peak, or the on-peak power price time, that they can take advantage of the gravity flow and not operate those pumps, or not operate the pumps as frequently. So 2016, we didn't have that program, and it cost us roughly $39 per million gallons to move that water out of Winfield Reservoir in Zone 1. In 2017, we started the program. In 2018, we've also seen that it's about $35 per million gallons to move that water.
Is there such a thing as a peak power these days, solar, flattening the curve?
So, well, as far as the PG&E charges, yeah, they still charge, because we don't have solar at the...
No, not solar, I'm just saying, because without the curve, at one time there was a significant difference.
Yes.
My understanding is that has been...
Yeah, you're talking about what they call the duck curve, and I imagine that's going to be talked about later in the presentation.
Yeah, we'll cover the impact of solar and so forth, yes.
Speaking of solar, So we have some solar panels here at headquarters. I don't want to get into this because our consultants are going to talk about some solar projects, but I just want to mention that we do have solar panels on the north side of the property here. They're the vehicle overhangs and the materials bins covered. So I'll just share with it that we get about $7,500 a year in offsetting power credits from those solar panels. Building systems controls, we're currently scoping an RFP to get improved building systems controls. We do have some here for this facility, but they're antiquated. They're sort of like first generation. We have it has its own computer and a closet, and it's kind of clunky, and you know, it has like a Monday through Friday scheduling, but somebody forgets to go overwrite it for a holiday. So the new systems are a lot more smarter. We'll have remote access. We'll be able to get an app, a web portal. We'll be able to do those kind of things. They rely on energy data, satellite. So they'll be more refined. So hopefully we'll get more savings out of those. Then the EV charging stations. As you probably know, we've got 3 electrical vehicle charging stations out front. We don't gain anything from that. In fact, we meet with finance every year. We go through that. We don't want to make sure we're not losing money, but we're also not profiting off of that. But I just mentioned this because it does have a benefit for the district in that we are being environmental stewards and we're being community partners.
I have a question. Do we have any vehicles that are either plug-in hybrids or fully electric in our district?
Not at this time, we do not. We have some hybrids, but they're not plug-in hybrids.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've been saying the bottom line on everything, so here's the bottom line. And what I've tried to illustrate with this is even though we have a rather high $3.7 million operating budget, it would actually be $4.4 million if we weren't doing all the various cost-saving measures that we're doing. So we're going to try to grow that $700,000 figure by taking advantage of more programs and looking for more ways of cutting our costs. So that's it for the operational side.
Okay, a member of the public would like to make a comment, so I'm going to do it at this time, sir.
Yeah, thank you, President Gunther. We do have a member of the public. My understanding is he missed the public comment portion of the meeting. We'd like to accommodate that. I understand it does pertain somewhat to the discussion this evening.
So I'd like to start with talking about energy pricing. The U.S. Department of Energy had a report about 2 years ago about California wholesale level pricing, the system aggregator at the wholesale level, and they were talking about occasionally you actually get negative pricing with 15-minute pricing intervals on an open market. You get negative pricing due to solar power in the middle of the day in California. That's so I guess it doesn't filter down to your level, but it's interesting that it's happening at the wholesale level and you guys don't see any benefit on the negative pricing. The 1.5% discount for this CCA, whatever it's called, this thing. Well, I was just at an environmental group meeting yesterday evening, and they're talking about there's this guy at Berkeley who's pushing Berkeley to go to the green energy thing, and they would do a surplus. They would do a surcharge, not a discount, the surcharge thing. That would be the default setting. So there's some political movement among the most liberal sections of this area to do that. And what was interesting at the meeting was everyone from who was outside of Berkeley in southern Alameda County in your jurisdiction, they're firmly opposed to this. They hate this idea of paying a lot more money for green energy. So I don't think that you guys are going to sign on either, not willingly. And then the energy consumption overall, if you look at the overall energy consumption in developed countries, 5 to 20% of the overall energy consumption of a society goes to water production, transportation, storage, treatment, sewage treatment, God knows. So the energy and water are inseparable. And when you get water shortages, the thermal plants are not very efficient. They actually have 50 to 60% of the heat that's produced in a thermal plant is fossil fuels or whatever, is waste heat, as all of you know. And that waste heat is cooled through water. And when you have water shortages, or if your river runs dry, or if your river is too hot, you end up having thermal plant electrical production shutdowns. And of course, Fukushima was a lack of cooling water. The Fukushima nuclear explosion was cooling water. So now, going on to my prepared remarks, which are 2 minutes. Groundwater aquifers in the Central Valley and Imperial Valley are being overdrawn. Aquifers may see irreversible compaction. Land is subsiding near Los Banos and Dos Palos in the Central Valley. The groundwater is contaminated by agricultural runoff, fertilizer, and pesticide residues. Salt is building up. Drinking water is contaminated in rural communities like Lost Hills in western Kern County. The health of residents, and these are poor farm workers who don't speak English, is imperiled. And they are going down to the corner machine and paying very high prices per liter or per gallon for a little bit of drinking water. Their stuff that comes out of their kitchen tap is, they won't even drink it. They call it the Lost Hills Limonada. The tax on drinking water has been floated to provide clean water for rural communities. However, in the early 1800s, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, said, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." Economists say that taxes reduce demand and suppress supply both at the same time. A tax on drinking water would be regressive. It would hit small customers hardest and hurt ACWD. The Alameda County Water District Board of Directors were right to oppose the tax on drinking water. There are two goals. First, I think we need to manage aquifers sustainably. Metering is essential to manage the depletion of groundwater, and you may know that a lot of groundwater is not metered in California. A statewide tax on groundwater extraction would help. Secondly, the General Assembly of the UN, the second goal, and the Constitution of India, that's a country in South Asia, have both recognized that clean water is a human right. A tax on groundwater extraction would help provide rural communities with clean water. So don't tax the smallest users. Tax the groundwater producers who are the ones who are polluting all these people. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Can we get your name for the record before you leave?
Oh, and the name is Kelly Abreu, Mission Peak Conservancy.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
Okay, any other questions for Dan? All right, so next up we'll move on to planning related to renewable energy and clean energy generation at ACWD. So the district's current plan related to renewable energy generation can be summarized as shown here. And that involves the installation of a large solar array on the district's property at a reservoir site at Winfield Reservoir over along 680 in Paseo in Washington. And this project is slated currently to start next fiscal year. So it's coming up pretty fast. Also included in the plan, and again you can see the excerpt from the strategic plan initiatives at the bottom of the slide. Also included in the plan are solar installations that would be implemented at the time that we replace reservoir roofs as part of our seismic improvement program. So it's sort of an opportunistic approach toward solar implementations at the district. Also, when we do a major renovation on the headquarters facilities roofs, we would do the same thing. Yes, sir.
John, go ahead. Well, one, doing it at the time of replacement roof is better because we had previous proposals we would do at midterm replacement, and when we had to redo the roofs, we had an extraordinary cost involved. So we've gotten around that. But one of my understanding is in the past, I don't know if it was promoting the thin film solar panels that could lay in and not have a minimum weight, only to learn, and so that technology hasn't been evaluated at all. And second, what are the additional construction costs of having to build the roofs so they can support the solar panels? We had an incident where we did that, and then they came back and I was told by staff, well, solar panels will be too heavy, they will not fit on the design that we just approved.
So in terms of the thin film, I'll throw that question to our consultants when we get there, when we start talking about solar alternatives, which have been analyzed further and above and beyond what we had done even in 2015 and 2016. We do have a thin film type solar system currently on our carports here and on the materials bins. And that's the system that Dan had described. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you had in mind. It is a very lightweight system.
It's this year.
Yeah, in terms of the incremental cost to design a roof that can handle solar panels, if you, as compared to a roof that can't handle solar panels, if you're talking about the type of design that we're planning to do with a seismic retrofit, the incremental cost is negligible. These roofs are going to be suitable for seismic forces, and really what you're talking about, adding a panel to a roof, you're talking about additional wind load, additional live load, or dead load on the roof, and as long as it's part of the design criteria, the actual difference in cost should be not great.
So this is new construction roofs?
Correct. We're replacing the entire roof. Okay.
So, comment and a question. We've been talking about putting solar on at Winfield since before I was on the board. And I've always been enthusiastic about putting solar out there. It's a nice clear field with a solid roof. And when I went through the presentation, you're anticipating moving forward a year from now. But the concern I have is going through all the permitting with the city, neighborhood issues, because I could anticipate that neighbors might not be too happy with a solar field right across from their homes. They might actually intimate that they may have a loss of property value. We may have to consider berms around the solar field, maybe like USD has done close by here, down the road. So while we have it on the calendar for FY 1920, which is just around the corner, I hope the staff is taking a look at all those issues and impediments that may crop up along the way.
Yeah, certainly we're aware of, we expect a number of challenges, and not just with the Whitfield site. And actually we'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues and some potential approaches to minimize the district's exposure. However, they're not, no approach that we take would keep us from having to confront those issues.
I could see the same issues cropping up at Mayview Reservoir, for example.
Yeah.
Because the folks up there, they're very wealthy, and they're going to say it's an eyesore.
Okay.
Not that our roof is any much better to look at.
Maybe it's not that bad. Some of the others maybe aren't that great. Okay, so speaking of the capital improvement program, this is what the plan that I just described, this is what it looks like in a little bit more detail. Actually, what I'm showing you here is an excerpt from our preliminary CIP. So as you know, we're in the middle, well, toward the end of our capital budgeting process right now. And so the board will see in May at the budget workshop more detail related to the CIP. But this is an excerpt from the current plan. And what you see here is what you described, Director Sethy. You see solar at Whitfield being implemented next fiscal year. Again, this is based upon the plan that we, as you point out, we've been discussing for some time. It's finally here. It may not turn out this way because of a number of issues, but this is the current plan. And then you can see, again, the various reservoirs involved in the seismic improvement program and the roof rehabilitation and replacement work that's planned. And you can see the gold stars there are essentially, the thinking there is that is the time that solar would be implemented on those, at those facilities, essentially following roof replacement, or essentially designed as part of the roof replacement work, and the solar would be implemented at the time that roof replacement work is complete.
Are we anticipating doing a roof replacement at Whitfield?
No, so yeah, so I could have been clearer. So the very top line is Whitfield Reservoir, and so that can be done absent any other major work at the site. That's As you know, the entire site's over 5 acres, and a portion of the site contains a buried structure, that's the reservoir. The remainder of the site is just open land. And so the thinking back in 2016 was we would install the solar array on the portion of the site that's not reservoir. And so to do that wouldn't require any sort of structural work. It's simply a matter of installing the system. Of course, there's electrical work, there's other work, there's obviously permitting, there are other issues, security, there are a number of other things that would have to be resolved. But that was the thinking. And so it's available space, it's not being used currently, and our current planning doesn't have us make use of the remainder of the site as reservoir for the foreseeable future. So certainly longer than any sort of solar implementation life would be. So that's the current thinking, you're right. So Winfield Reservoir doesn't have a roof per se, and we could do that without relying on another capital program project that's budgeted. So these other facilities, though, you can see headquarters here. There are 2 different projects to replace or to rehabilitate the roof over the garage, another project to rehabilitate the roof over the headquarters main building. Dakota Reservoir is a roof replacement, and Alameda Reservoir is also a roof replacement. Patterson Reservoir, I'll point out that we have 2 categories of reservoirs and related projects shown here. So we have higher certainty projects, and we have what we've called lower certainty projects. The higher certainty projects, it's understood that reservoir is very important to the district. We fully intend to upgrade the structure so that it can survive the big earthquake that we expect will be here at some point. So those projects are going to happen with or without solar, right? So the lower certainty projects that you see listed at the bottom, those reservoirs, the future of those reservoirs is not entirely certain at this point. And that has to do with a number of factors that are different for each reservoir, and I'll summarize really briefly. To say Middlefield Reservoir is a large, it's a cut and cover reservoir. It's in Zone 1. It's actually a small reservoir relative to the rest of the storage we have in Zone 1. It's immediately adjacent to the fault, and it has a Division of Safety of Dams jurisdictional embankment. So it's got a number of seismic challenges. And there is a possibility that depending on how we operate our water distribution system in the future, it may not be that valuable to us from a storage standpoint. It may be, but one of the things we have in our planning is to take a look at that facility and understand whether it's worth putting the dollars into upgrading it structurally and replacing the roof. We're talking some millions of dollars to do that. So that's something that's under evaluation. And then Patterson Reservoir is not quite the same issues, but it's also a DSOD jurisdictional facility. It's a cut and cover reservoir with a jurisdictional embankment. That reservoir is hydraulically about 10 feet lower than the rest of the storage in Zone 1. And it also has operating restrictions resulting from the DSOD requirements. And so what we end up doing with Patterson Reservoir in the future is not entirely clear. So right now our thinking in terms of an absolute slam dunk solar installation, we don't see that as being certain yet. So that's why we call it a little bit lower certainty here.
What is the imputed value and the payback time that we're suggesting for each of these projects?
We will get there with a separate slide discussion. Have more information than you could possibly ask for. Of course, I say that, and we'll see. So, just a quick refresher on how we got there. How did we arrive at the plan that we're dealing with today? Back in 2015 and 2016, staff, and in fact, Shane Oneski led that effort, conducted an in-depth analysis of various alternatives for clean and renewable energy of various types at many different district sites. That was a fairly in-depth evaluation that was done with the objective of informing the capital improvement program and presenting our recommendations to the board. And again, that became, the findings from that effort became the basis of what's currently in the CIP. So just a quick refresher as to what that looks like. So we evaluated multiple alternatives. We cast a very wide net, took a look at lots of different types of technologies, including wind tower, fuel cell, hydroelectric, solar, biomass, ocean energy, nuclear, geothermal. So very wide net, but one thing I'll point out that we did not look at, actually two things we did not look at. We did not look at battery storage, and we did not look at floating solar. They were not analyzed at that time. They weren't mature at that point. But it's something of note here because we will be talking a little bit more about those technologies coming up. And the process was as shown here. There was a pretty rigorous feasibility analysis that looked at available sites, available resources like wind or natural gas and so forth, infrastructure requirements, and then land use and permitting issues like you point out there. Those alternatives that seemed most feasible passed through to a financial analysis that included an evaluation of life cycle costs based upon expected cost savings and energy cost reductions. That looked at available incentives and funding sources, and it also looked at the timing of various projects in the capital program and what we expected in the way of facility improvement. So it was a significant effort at that time. And again, the end result of that work was a recommendation to install solar panels at Whitfield, and to do that under a power purchase agreement. And we'll get into what that means a little bit more coming up. And also to plan for solar for reservoirs as the roofs were replaced. Also to ultimately have solar installed here at headquarters, and then to continue to evaluate a number of technologies that were sort of on the tipping point and that we saw the market changing over time and we wanted to continue to monitor. So those are essentially the major outcomes of that work that occurred in 2015 and 2016.
Can I ask a question about the solar headquarters?
Yeah.
Here, one thought occurred to me that, and I think I mentioned it at a previous meeting, putting up carports like we have down at the police station or Hall of Justice, and putting solar on top of that, and at the same time it's providing shade for all the cars out in the lot here. Could we generate as much solar power as is required by putting it on carports versus putting it on the roof here of the headquarters? Because I'm thinking that may become an impediment at some point in the future where we actually have to do some real physical work on the structure of the headquarters here.
Well, we have to have that answer in a future slide as well. We've broken out the effects of solar on the roofs versus solar on other areas here at headquarters, and we can show you that difference in upcoming slides.
So the quick answer is, could we generate as much from the carports as on the roof?
If you were to compare the two, which one would be more? Could we generate enough?
Yeah.
I'll actually ask our consultant team that question. I don't know if you heard the question.
No, we gave it to him on the previous question.
Oh, okay. Well, it was basically the previous question, just restated. So, if we're looking at solar at headquarters, only in carports and other structures, not including the facility roofs, does generation from those carports and ancillary structures, does that equal the power that we could get out of solar system implemented on the roofs?
The solar that would be powered from the areas that we consider for parking lot canopies is greater than what comes from the rooftops. The only issue is that the parking lot canopies, because of the additional structures, typically cost a little bit more per unit of capacity installed. So we looked at both, primarily just because we're looking to optimize the system size. The larger, typically the better procurement you can get from vendors and so forth. So we made sure to try to get every square inch that could host a solar PV system and outlined it in our analysis.
Our recommendation is to do both, and we have the analysis for each piece in total. It's not built right into the presentation, so if you wanted more details on the analysis of this versus this rather than this plus this, then we can give that to your staff and they can get it to you.
Okay, great, great.
Yeah, in terms of total power output, the non-roof solar is about double the roof solar. But again, the economics are a little bit different.
Personal opinion, I would be in favor of spending a little extra on the solar canopies versus putting it on the roof here.
Okay.
Personal opinion.
And that's something we often hear from public agencies, because you see it when you drive in, and it really is a statement by the district that you believe in renewable energy, greenhouse gas reduction. So typically it's worth it to spend a little bit extra.
Right.
All right. Okay, so that was a review of our 2015 and 2016 planning. So taking a quick look at our current efforts. Essentially, because our clean energy planning informs our capital program, and because our first major solar installation is programmed for next fiscal year, we wanted to take a very careful look at the analysis that we've done in the past, and also the board, of course, has a lot of interest in this topic. And so as we prepared for this workshop, we also wanted to revisit this topic. And so we sought the services of an independent expert in this field to make sure that we were on the right track. And so staff formed a team consisting of a number of folks that are in this room and others to put out a competitive procurement for this type of service. And from that process, we awarded a project to Michael D. Brown Consulting Engineers, who you've now met. Michael Brown being the project manager and principal consultant, and then Ryan Ramos being the technical consultant and doing a great deal of the legwork here in terms of modeling and so forth. And you can see the team here has been at this work for quite some time, having been involved in lots of similar analyses and also implementations of lots and lots of different renewable and clean energy implementations throughout the state and elsewhere. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Brown to start us off in terms of reviewing their evaluation of our clean energy plan and thoughts that they had about the work that we've done in the past and where we could go from here.
Okay, Michael, I'll pass this to you first. Thank you. Speak from the bench. Well, thank you. So I am Michael Brown, and as Ed said, we were hired earlier this year through a competitive process for basically providing you an independent review of the work that your staff did in 2016. And to get to Dan Stevenson's bottom line, they did a great job, and we concur with their basic recommendations. A lot has changed since then, and so we were able to update numbers. For example, price of panels have dropped significantly since they got pricing, so the solar projects look better. Some of the incentive programs, basically all of the incentive programs have changed since 2015, 2016 when they were doing their work, so we reran the numbers with the current day's incentives so that you have updated numbers. The only other major, I'd say, new thing that we suggested to look at were the two that Ed mentioned earlier. There's been a lot of work in floating solar projects. We call them photovoltaics. And since you have wide open pits, and that's where we looked at pits 1 and 2, we thought that might make an interesting thing to do, way to not get involved with roofs, not tie up your land, do something a little more innovative, and Ryan will present the results of that analysis. The other is battery storage, and it's interesting because your timing is perfect. We did a very parallel project, Ryan and I, with Union Sanitary. It's up the road, down the road, I guess. And it was about 3 years ago, and it was really close at that time between battery and not battery. There were companies that were starting up and companies that were dying almost daily. It was kind of a turbulent time. There were some, Tesla, of course, was one of the most, I guess, the best known battery storage. They're a local company. They were making lots of offers to people. Some of their projects weren't working so well, and there was maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. It was a very difficult decision. They decided to wait, and it was a wise thing, because in the interim between 2015, 16, 17, and 18, good shakeout in the battery world. A lot of the flimsier companies, the less well-capitalized, the less technically oriented, are now not with us. Strong companies are here, and so we thought that this would be another good place to look for you that wasn't initially done, and rightly so, wasn't initially looked at in 2016. So Ryan's going to go through the details. We have lots of numbers and lots of things to show you, and then we'll bring that all together into recommendations or to ideas about things that you could do in your capital improvement plan and ways to get these projects moving. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, and we're happy to take your questions at any time through the presentation.
Good afternoon, board and staff. We're going to basically cover our methodology and then go through the results of our findings for the clean power plan analysis. So first, I want to go through the first methodology, which is the screening process, what we use to kind of narrow down the project that would advance to the final financial analysis. And so we did very similar to what the district did. We took a look at site constraints, resource constraints, how well the sun shines at a particular location, how strong the wind blows, how far the water falls, and how much of that water falls. So we took those into consideration in judging these projects that the district had identified and moved them forward to a full financial analysis. The next step we did was some pretty intense modeling of these sites. So the first thing we looked at was the electricity data. And so for each site, we had 15-minute interval data. And so that's 35,040 discrete data points for energy use over the course of a year. Took that information, ran that in parallel with a modeled system. So for a solar PV system, for instance, we created a representative system which consisted of modules, inverters, balance of system components, put that together, ran the model with the particular resource. So for solar, we obtained the information from the National Renewable Energy Lab and the solar installation for each individual site, ran those numbers to come up with the value of the electricity that's generated from the system. So there's two value streams associated with that. One is the offset of the electricity at the site, and the second value stream is the additional electricity above and beyond use at the site, which would be enrolled in the ResBEC program, which Dan had spoken about earlier. So that's kind of a large portion of the value stream comes from generating excess power at those individual sites. So the next item that we took the information from this modeling exercise and plugged it into our financial model. So our financial model took into consideration when the electricity was generated, because that's where the value is associated. So electricity generated during the peak period is worth more than electricity generated in the evenings or at nighttime for some of these other technologies. So we were able to take into consideration the time of generation and how that time of generation impacts the value stream of the electricity. So that's the main benefit that comes from these electricity generating projects. On the other side of the equation, we have the costs associated with them, which include the capital costs, operation and maintenance, and combining those two values, we came up with, we use this in a cash flow analysis, which I'll describe in a slide, not the next slide, but the following slide. The next slide just talks about the technologies we looked at, which ones advanced to the financial analysis stage. So we looked at solar. So the ones that advanced include solar, wind, hydro, fuel cell, and battery storage, which was one that was not looked at in 2016. And the ones that did not move forward were geothermal, biomass, and cogeneration. There's essentially no real geothermal source available to the district. There's also no biomass production from district operations that could be used for any kind of biomass generator. And there's no heat load at the site that would benefit from a cogeneration type
One quick question. The sludge that we have at TP2, for example, isn't that organic matter that could go into a biomass type facility?
It's organic, yeah, but as I understand it, I don't know if you've got anything to add, but as I understand it,
There's not as much organic as you might think.
Right.
It's primarily the coagulant, ferric chloride, that's used to coagulate the solids in the said basin. So it's not it wouldn't be good for your lawn or your landscaping as a nutrient. So no, it has a very low, relatively low organic component.
Okay.
Next, I want to describe the financial analysis methodology. So we used a life cycle analysis to determine the net present value in order to determine the feasibility of each project and then also rank them relative to the other projects that we looked at. So this methodology looks at the revenues, costs, and the net financial benefits to the district over the project lifetime, and that lifetime varies depending on the technology. For a solar or a wind project, we're looking at a 20-year lifetime. Fuel cell project, typically at 15 years, and for a battery storage project, it's 10 years. So then we take those benefits and they're discounted over the course of the lifetime of the system in order to give you the net present value. So you may be familiar with how a net present value analysis works. Any positive value basically means it's financially feasible. Anything that's negative means it's not feasible financially. So within that financial analysis, we looked at 3 different scenarios for each technology and site pairing. The first scenario is a district-owned project that goes through the pay-as-you-go process. Typically, the district would collect funds in order to pay for a project up front and cover the entire cost in that manner. Another scenario we looked at was district-owned, but financed through a low-interest loan as available from the California Energy Commission. The California Energy Commission has a 1% low-interest loan for energy projects covering solar, wind, hydro, and the only constraints within that loan are the project needs to have a 20-year or earlier payback, and it's a $3 million maximum loan amount per project.
And it's only available for local government agencies. It's not available for the private sector.
Right. The third scenario we looked at was basically a public-private partnership where the project is owned by a private developer and the developer sells the energy to the district. In this case, this is a very commonly used structure, primarily because of the tax credits that are available for energy technologies. So there's the investment tax credit, which currently is at 30% of capital costs, and then there's also accelerated depreciation for that capital expenditure. And the next slide will show kind of an example of how the tax credit plays out as far as being able to monetize that number through a private entity. So if we're going to, for instance, take a project cost of $1 million, the developer can take the investment tax credit as a cut from their tax bill, and we're assuming this occurs in 2020. 2020, the investment tax credit is 26%. So 26% of $1 million is $260,000. So that's straight to the developer's bottom line. And the second tax benefit is accelerated cost recovery, and this is assuming a corporate tax rate of 21%. The value of this accelerated cost recovery is $178,500. So out of the $1 million project cost, a private developer can obtain $438,500. So basically 44% of the cost can be absorbed by tax credits and accelerated cost recovery. And within particular PPA structures, there are ways for the developer to own the system for a period of time, typically 6 or 7 years, in order for the developer to obtain the required rate of return, following which the developer can flip the project to the district. In many cases, that becomes the best financial method to generate these projects. So the first project I wanted to look at is, or I wanted to present is wind. So there's a lot of numbers kind of shown on this table, but the couple of main items I wanted to look at here. So we looked at two sites. One is at the Patterson Reservoir and one is at desalination. I think the key value I want to look at is the capacity factor, and that's how often the wind turbine is actually going to be turning at 100% capacity. So if you look at Patterson Reservoir, it's listed at 23%, and for desalination, it's listed at 14%. So to give you an idea of what 23%, 14% means relative to what a typical wind turbine facility would generate, 35% is the average utility scale wind power capacity factor. So we're looking at the wind sites the district has as being kind of marginal and suboptimal for a typical wind installation. And so the key columns I want to draw your attention to are the 20-year NPVs for both PAYGO, the CEC loan, and for a PPA. All of them are showing a negative NPV, which indicates infeasible, financially infeasible project. So wind doesn't really perform very well, primarily because the wind resource isn't very good. A couple other issues with wind at this site are the lack of a self-generating incentive program incentive. That's a California-wide incentive available for generation technology that produce electricity for on-site use. There's a clause within the SGIP program that states essentially that you need to be producing a certain percentage of your demand via that wind turbine. Because the Patterson Reservoir has such little energy demand, the wind turbine far exceeds that minimum number that in order to qualify for that question.
Yeah. Question for staff. It wasn't answered in the presentation, but I was wondering, among all of our facilities, where does the desal plant rank in terms of energy consumption? And how much?
Well, I can tell you that the energy consumption at desal, or the cost to operate desal, is about half energy. Relatively speaking, desal is our most energy-intensive production facility because we have to pump the water from the aquifer, then we have to boost it through the RO membranes, and then we have to boost it again to get it out of the distribution system. So far and above, in terms of unit energy per million gallon, the desal is the most expensive. But overall, it has our cheapest unit cost of production.
May I add to that the cost of power for the desal is an industrial rate, which when I last heard was about 8 cents per kilowatt hour, a small fraction of the cost of our other electric power, and solar doesn't compare at all. It's not the power cost that you would want to put into this equation.
No comment.
So, do you have a broad range of, out of the $3.7 million or $4.4 million that we're spending, how much the dollar expenditure is for energy on
At
desal?
desal, we have that information. We just did our budgets, but I don't have that with me.
Okay. So, you and I have talked at various times when we've been on field trips about putting solar on, let's say, Patterson Reservoir in the future or another reservoir and getting the credit back directly to the desal plant, which was a question I had been asking early on, a few years back. So is that still conceptually what we're thinking about, that we could get the credit back and put it towards the most energy?
So I'm going to tweak the question a little bit. At our hydroelectric facility, at our water treatment plant 2, we're part of that RESPECT program. Could something like that be done at Patterson Reservoir, where we have a surplus energy generated from our from a solar installation and applied to, say, our desalination plant in another part of town?
The answer to both of your questions is yes. In fact, that's how we modeled this. We took Patterson, for example. Patterson, in any of these scenarios, solar or wind, would generate way more electricity than is used at Patterson because there's very small electrical demand. So we modeled it that you would build the project as we show it, use whatever small amount can be used at each site, and all of the rest would go through ResBec to some other place based on how high the rates were, and
Okay.
desal is most of that.
So I'll let you answer this later in the presentation here, but I just want to raise my personal view, which has been that we try to create energy credits where we can in our district and apply it toward the most energy intensive unit, which is the desal, which you just answered affirmatively.
What could I counter that by saying is the problem with the presentation so far is that you have not segregated the industrial component, which is a small fraction of the cost of our cost that is operating the headquarters and other facilities. There's apples and oranges. You don't want to aggregate them. You should keep them separate because solar doesn't fit into an equation. It's far more expensive. We don't have good parity for this Senate, and we certainly don't have good parity when we talk about our industrial power users, which is the major plants and our primary driver.
Well, the way that the credits are valued are based on what the schedule is for the generation site and not for the site receiving the benefit of the credit. So the way we modeled it and how PG&E has their rate schedule set up is they have a rate schedule known as option R, which is for solar specific projects. And they changed their rate schedule to have the value of the electricity produced during the peak period, which is now 12 to 6, May through October, as being the highest value electricity. So most of these solar systems are producing most of their electricity during that peak period and accruing credits, and I believe it's 26 cents per kilowatt hour during those peak periods.
Even though we're paying 8 or 9 cents per kilowatt hour for the power we're buying from the grid.
Correct. So the credit is 26 cents during those time periods, and those are directly credited against your what's called a benefiting account, the account that's tied to it. So you're basically, the electricity you're generating has 3x the value of the electricity you're paying for. So it's a net positive for the district.
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether it's 8 cents, 15 cents, or 18 cents. You're getting enough credit to take care of all of your energy bills.
That's the intent, is to generate the highest value credit.
But it's costing you 26 cents to produce that power.
No,
versus
you're
the 9
getting 26
You're getting
cents.
credit for the margin, but you're putting all this in, it's costing you a lot of money to produce the base power.
And we are going to present to you the cost of these too, so you can see for
26
yourself.
versus 9.
We found net present value positive in all cases in solar. We can show you that. Where that sometimes gets confused with the term grid parity is that it includes the incentives that are available. Things like PG&E paying you 26 cents for solar power and charging you 8 cents at the same time in a different place, the investment tax credit that Ryan explained. So we looked at it from the practical business standpoint of can you save money as the district by doing these renewable energy projects, even though in a true sense grid parity may or may not have been achieved at this point. And there are various arguments as to whether it has or has not yet in California.
I would argue, particularly for us on our industrial side, and that the numbers you're using are adjusted annually by PG&E. That's not for the life of the project, but they'll guarantee that 26 cents by that.
That's correct.
Just to finish up on the wind side, there's a couple other implementation challenges. Wind typically requires at least a year's data collection from an anemometer that you would pay to install at the site. And also there's likely to be significant environmental study associated with any wind project, avian studies, visual impacts to local areas. So this adds in addition to it not being financially feasible, there are other components of implementing this project that would be relatively challenging.
Did we look at wind up at TP1 where you get good wind going over the Sonoma Grade?
I don't think so. No, really.
Because I thought if we put wind up there, not the big enormous windmills, but there might be some opportunity to do something there where it's kind of hidden in the back pasture, you know, but you get some good wind going over the hill there.
So I can say a number of years ago when Greg Watson was evaluating wind power feasibility, his opinion at the time was that DSAL was a superior site than Mission San Jose. And my guess is that part of that equation related to the power demand at the DSAL site as well. But I remember having a conversation with him, and he said, in terms of the intensity of the wind, and what you'll see is that it's super site-specific, that would require much more additional study to determine exactly what the feasibility is. This is kind of like back of the envelope here, fair, or a little better than that maybe. But his opinion at the time was that the two sites were sort of on parity. And I remember coming across a report that was made in the 70s on wind power, believe it or not, at DSAL, and the decision was made not to go forward at that site at that time, for a number of reasons.
And it's worthy of a footnote, the proximity to the wildlife refuge, which could result in the shutdown of any wind power on short notice.
Just to close the loop on that one, Shane and I reviewed the wind calcs that we did back in 2016, and those two sites, DSAL and Mission San Jose, are almost identical. So they have a similar factor.
I see. Okay.
And just to further beat a dead horse, because we think wind is a dead horse for you, the DSAL has an advantage in that it does have a large on-site consumption and might qualify for the self-generation incentive program. So were we to run the analysis on that one, it would be worse because it would be equivalent to DSAL because it is about the same wind speed, and then worse because a big grant that all of us as PG&E ratepayers are kicking in on every one of our bills would not be available for it. So it's definitely not worth your spending money on having us analyze it. We can tell you right now it will come out worse than you.
The next technology I would like to present is the hydropower site. The district looked at 5 sites, and we subsequently reviewed them as well. So the 5 sites reviewed include Velocitos, which is presently existing channel. So this assumes that a pipeline alternative is implemented at this site in order to capture the hydropower there. Looked at the Appian tank, the Avalon tank, SF blender, and the treatment plant to Winfield. And you can see in the table here there are a number of issues associated with them that deem them infeasible to move forward with. At Velocitos, you do have high head and high flow, but that flow occurs only, I believe it was 38% of the time. At both tanks, you have an insufficient and intermittent flow. And for the blender, the low power production, given the fact that the flow and the head are relatively feasible, but kind of in the grand scheme of putting in a plant, we deemed it not feasible. And that the treatment plant to Whitfield, the head, the height from the top end of the system to the lower end is insufficiently high to generate enough force. So again, just to kind of briefly cover, sites typically have adequate head but insufficient flow, and our recommendation is to have no further consideration for hydro plants.
What's the difference between from the beginning of the Velocitos channel to the termination and elevation drop-off?
Do you have that shown?
Velocitos is 300 feet with 13,000 gallons per minute of flow.
So even though it's an intermittent flow, and it's gravity fed, wouldn't it become useful at, just during those interim time periods?
If you put the pipeline in, then it might. It didn't pencil for us at 38%. So if you put the pipeline in and you increase the flow, the duration of flow, then it's definitely worth looking at again in the future.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, essentially this first scenario of Aziz is a little bit hypothetical. This pipeline currently doesn't exist, but one of the things I think the board knows is that we need to fix Aziz channel right now. There's a lot of issues out there, and so one of the alternatives we're analyzing is a pipeline alternative to the channel. And we know that if we were to replace the channel with a pipeline, we'd have a lot of head available and some flow available, and so we asked MDB to take a look at that hypothetical situation, see whether or not, given that head and given the expected intermittent flow, whether that hydro would pencil out. So they are assuming the hypothetical situation where we have a completed pipeline replacing the channel that is falling several hundred feet in head, but it's given the low use of that pipeline at the flow rates that would require to generate power, it doesn't pencil out.
At the termination of the pipeline, let's assume you have a generator there, and you're generating power. Where would it feed to?
Yeah. It'd have to go back into the grid. There's no power use on that site. It would all be res-spec power to go back into the grid. So we'd only get a fraction of that value at another site, at a receiving site or a benefiting site like DSA.
First of all, we do have hydros currently in operation from Mission San Jose Gun Electric Plant here, and that's been successful. Balacitos is rarely used in the sense of water flow, but Shane, hopefully as the litigation continues on the continuation of the state water project, we can negotiate the transfer of Balacitos to the state water plant and get it off our back out of our eye.
I'm going to say this facetiously, but did we look at hydro on the Alameda Creek?
Yeah. But there is, I would hope someday when we do develop and retrofit the Niles Canyon Aqueduct, the hydro can be this option.
We could put hydro right at the dams, so when you have high flows, you know, it's going over.
Okay.
I'm sure I could come up with something creative.
With our really happy note, can we move on?
Sure. Next, I wanted to present fuel cells. And so fuel cells have evolved over the years and have certainly improved in efficiency and applicability. Typically right now they're used in high priority and high value facilities that need uninterruptible power. So in some instances you'll see them with some of the big tech companies that have data centers that need to have 100% reliability. So having a secondary source of power that they can run and have natural gas flow to if there's, in the case of an electrical outage. And they're willing to pay a premium for that availability of uninterruptible power. Fuel cells can also serve as emergency backup, so there are certain areas where fuel cells do have a good niche to fill. But some of the downsides to fuel cells are the electricity from fuel cells, and most fuel cells are naturally gas fueled. So you are seeing a much higher greenhouse gas production from fuel cells versus the grid. For instance, the fuel cell that we modeled is a Bloom box, which is the most commonly used fuel cell module anywhere for this type of application. It produces somewhere between 680 and 730 pounds per megawatt hour, whereas the PG&E grid is at pounds of greenhouse gases per megawatt hour, CO2 equivalent. Currently, the PG&E grid is at 300 pounds of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, so it's about 2.5 times less greenhouse gas emissions from the grid source electricity than it would be from an on-site fuel cell. Do you have a question? Yeah.
The cost difference, not the environmental side. What is the actual dollar?
That'll come up in the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. So moving on to the financial analysis, we did look at financial analysis with the fuel cell being able to reduce the demand charge of the sites that we looked at. So desalination and PT well blending and Maori are the sites we looked at for this. And assuming that there's strong value to having a fuel cell because of that demand charge reduction. The one other issue that comes with fuel cell is natural gas price risk. That's an item that in many of the different financing arrangements that exist for fuel cells, either the site host takes on that natural gas price risk, or in some contracts we've seen the developer will actually take on some of that natural gas price risk. So that's really the largest uncertainty with fuel cells. And here are the numbers for the fuel cell analysis. And so we looked at 3 different locations and then 2 different sizes at the desalination plant, primarily because we wanted to see scaling up the fuel cell and achieving similar economies of scale, how that would impact the numbers. And so the one scenario in which we see positive net present value is for the desalination for 600 kilowatts, so it's the top row, at a 2% expected gas escalation rate. So as you see it, as we increase the gas escalation rate, the net present value gets worse. So there's a narrow band in which fuel cells appear to be financially feasible. And again, the natural gas price risk is something that needs to be considered very strongly with this technology. The other item that is notable is that fuel cells are not eligible for the CEC loan, and that's why in this table you'll see that we only have the PAYGO and then the PPA scenario listed.
You've used the Bloom industry model and their cost factors.
Yes, we use their O&M.
When we looked at this in the past, their business model requiring a lease actually inflated the cost of what people felt if they had a competitor, they could bring that down. So that there was some feeling that their costs, at least currently, are significantly higher than they would be once competition picks up and their patents expire. So concerned about that. Second, that when you look at cost inflation of electricity is going to increase, and I'm concerned that we're using a fixed concept for the price of what the subsidies are going to be for solar and the offsets. So I'm more comfortable with natural gas in the long term, particularly with shale oil and the surplus of gas that's coming on the market for the foreseeable future, than I am with a electrical utility that is going into bankruptcy and may spin off its gas to take it totally out of that and with its own pure cost factor rates. So I'm more comfortable, just a rhetorical comment.
So I have a question for staff here. At our Maori well field, we have the diesel backup generator, that massive thing that we put in. We don't have anything like that at D-Cell.
That's correct. D-Cell was designed originally as a peaking facility, not as a core production facility.
Well, what happens if we have a major earthquake and we need the well fields and the D-Cell plant to be active? Let's assume for a minute we cannot run TP2.
If we lose PG&E power, we lose D-Cell. If we lose power at the Maori well field, we have 2 1050 kW generators with fuel capacity to run the entire well field for 3 days.
Yeah, so when I had originally brought up using Bloom fuel cells sometime back, I was thinking that this might be practical as for emergency purposes, that if we made the investment, it would always be something that we could reliably turn to, because you can even have gas stored right at the property. So I'm wondering if all of those things were looked at here.
We did not do, as part of this exercise, we did not do a review of the post-disaster scenario and how we could power multiple facilities with alternate power sources. Really, the objective here was to take a look at what makes financial sense and feasibility sense for normal operations. But we did talk about this issue. Essentially, what we concluded is certain alternatives or technologies penciled out financially for normal operations, others don't. For those that don't, and fuel cell is right in that category, that doesn't mean that there's not a place for it in our future. And I think you'll see a little bit later, we think that that's something to consider. One of the things that, again, that we'll be working on this next fiscal year has to do with that emergency contingency type planning. We're trying to ensure that as a routine part of our CIP planning process, that we include emergency response infrastructure needs. And so that effort will be taking place, but it wasn't done as part of this evaluation.
See, what I think is, what comes to mind is that it's great that we put in the diesel generator at, downtown, but in a major quake, we would be going weeks, months with problems in distribution of water and everything. And so I'm trying to think of a more reliable solution that we can turn on in that emergency situation at desal, at other operations. So that's where I thought the balloon fuel cell might come into play. And I appreciate the number analysis that you went through here, and even on a 15-year basis, if it is useful in an emergency situation, I don't mind the negative net present value figures here, because we're already over $100 million as an organization. 15 years from now, we're going to be that much bigger. You've got to put it in perspective. It's a small price, insurance price to pay to really count on having something reliably available. That's the way I look at it.
I think the only concern I would have with that is how what's the guarantee of the gas supply staying up? We'd have to obviously we'd have to store on site.
Yeah.
How much gas do we store? I'm not that familiar with the fuel cell and production of gas. I know they kind of need to be near a line. I would assume in a major quake, we might be better off just putting the generator out there.
And I'm in the same boat. It's definitely something worth looked at. But I do not understand the boom box enough to tell you how much storage do we need. Gas needs to be stored in a pressurized container. It comes with its own separate set of regulations, sizes, setback. There are a lot of challenges for actually putting the backup storage. Desal itself is in a liquefaction zone looking, I guess, since it's so close to the marshes. I think the board, outside of this topic right now, needs to talk about, is there a value to try to bring up a plant in a liquefaction zone after big emergency like an earthquake? Because it's very possible we could bring a plant up, but the rest of the infrastructure will be in pieces. Then that investment might not be worth it. So it's something that we should look at later, but let's focus today on normal operations. I think we could have a step 2 of the discussion on what we want to do in the emergency.
Yeah, I agree with Director Huang. I'm not trying to push one technology solution over another here. I think we really do need to have that future discussion on what do we do in the ultimate, earthquake emergency.
I just want to add, Ed and I have had this discussion specifically about these energy alternatives, but we felt that for tonight's meeting, we wanted to have this first broad brush look at the different options, and then perhaps for a second phase where we focus in more on cost-effective, good business case models. Then we look at the applicability of operational situations after a major disaster. So we were going to bring that in at a later time, but not now.
I'm glad you're thinking about it.
Yes, definitely.
I'm going to just a couple of concepts here. One is the ability to operate. A redundancy, the ability to hook up that Chechi power from the Newark substation would be something that I would encourage us to look at from a emergency response capability. Possibly get a much better contract than PG&E when it comes to power costs. Second, I look at the numbers here, and the 14.5 to 17 cents per kilowatt hour is very competitive to the middle 20s that we're looking at with the electric power generation. So it doesn't compare to the industrial rates that we're looking at. So that's where that overall bifurcating our system, what's industrial and what's non-industrial, is an important element in my mind when we do our calculations.
So can I ask for clarifications from staff? So there are a lot of numbers going around. So we'll just assume the industrial power rate we're buying is about 8 cents per kilowatt. Is that what we're talking about? And then I got the valuation here for the hypothetical scenario. That's number 2, how much it would cost us in theory to generate these powers. So what's that 20-some-odd cents number? Is that the number?
Okay, I'm definitely going to throw it to these guys because this is super complicated, but it's my understanding that 8 to 9 cents is a piece of the bill, and the bill is all on a kilowatt hour basis.
Right.
So that's the piece that relates to the energy cost.
That's the bulk of the bill.
That's a piece, right? And there's lots of different rate structures that have things parsed out different ways. And I don't know if you guys can give us a 2-sentence explanation to help us sort that out.
Yeah. So I want to just kind of back up to that point that I made about the 26 cents per kilowatt hour. So that is the credit value that comes from solar during a particular time period. So in the peak period, 12 p.m. to 6 p.m., May to October, when the solar system is generating electricity and is not being used on site, it's basically generating a credit of 26
so that's
cents.
how much PG&E will pay us.
Right.
That is not how much it costs us to generate power at that time.
And that's how much they'll pay us this year.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And during that time period. So in the wintertime and in the non-peak or partial peak periods, the credit value will be less. To give you a sense of the average credit value from a solar site, it averaged between 12.5 cents and 13 cents per kilowatt hour for the credit value over the course of a full year.
It's the only way I can explain power pricing simply, I'll get 2 cents, is it's like a plane ticket from here to Hawaii. It has nothing to do with how much the fuel costs, how much the pilot gets paid, how much the plane costs, when it was depreciated. It's what the market will bear at that time. And so if you go in the middle of summer and you buy it at the last minute, the ticket might be $3,000. And if you want to sit in front, it might be $5,000. If you go in the middle of the night, well, winter's nice there, but in some off-peak season, you might get it for $300. So there's no simple way, because that's not how power is priced or charged.
That is perfectly fine. What I was trying to get at is there was some reference on this side of the board saying that it costs us 20+ cents to generate power. I just want to make sure I don't need the exact number. I just need to have the magnitude of what we are paying, what my cost is to generate, and what PG&E will cost us. So those are basically 3 different numbers that we're kind of talking about.
You can see it on this chart, even though it's kind of a confusing chart. At the top line, at 14.5 cents, what this says is approximately a break-even project. You make a positive 71,000 over 15 years, which in my mind is still kind of break-even. So you could look at that differently, and you could say the Bloom box at 600 kilowatts costs all in, capital, operating costs, profit for the operator, and so forth, because this assumes a Bloom-type service contract, is 14.5 cents. So that's kind of, and similarly, the solar chart we will be showing you, the wind chart we showed you, that number is the basis that we said, okay, if you can get a company to commit to doing that project at that price, you either save a whole lot of money or you don't save any money, and that's how we do it.
Got it. Thank you.
Just out of curiosity, when you put down 600 kilowatts for a fuel cell, is that one bloom box or is it multiple units?
Three. The 200 kilowatt unit.
Okay.
And for your comments, most of your comments about the reliability, that adds to reliability because no bloom box by itself is 100% reliable. Yet if you have three of them, then you know that most likely two of them will be working operable at any given time. So, and that's why we put those comments in, hoping to spark this kind of discussion about the people who are entities that have the need for reliability and value that, then that's extra for over what we show here. So good discussion.
Yeah, I have mentioned in previous meetings, I know the founders of Bloom and were there when they first set up their building in Sunnyvale.
Mm-hmm.
And I took our local state senator, at that time he was an assemblyman, a council member, over there to show Bob Wachowski what was going on. And I've always been excited about that technology. It's pretty nifty stuff.
Yeah, I visited their facility also. I was also awarded 4 projects from the state of California, 2 prisons and 2 universities, to try to develop fuel cells there to both use the electricity and the heat that's generated to keep the students or the prisoners warm. And we tried so hard to develop it. It was the natural gas risk at the time that was the killer. The state went through a program in the 80s on cogeneration, combined heat and power. They awarded lots of PTAs, private companies built projects, and everyone went bankrupt. Because what happened was power values went down, natural gas spiked, and nobody could make the difference.
You'll like this story because you're right involved in the trade. When I was first introduced to the founder, they had no name for the company. And so about a month later, when I was re-engaged with them, I said, so what are you going to name the company? He says, oh, my kids named it. And they said, Dad, you're coming up with a new company. It's like something is blooming. It's coming up new. And he said, that's not a bad name. That's where Bloom came from. From the kids at the breakfast table.
You know, if we gave you a big list of things we said don't consider any further, we gave you another big list of things we said look really good. Fuel cells not in either of those categories. It's something that really has to do with your policies and how you value greenhouse gas, because you will produce more greenhouse gas on the one side on the negative, better reliability at decel on the positive. It's really one that can take more thinking about than this kind of overview study can get into.
I have one final comment. The reason why we have 600 kilowatts shown there is that's our monthly maximum demand at that site. So our monthly maximum is 524 kilowatts. That system is sized appropriately to accommodate the maximum demand.
Mm-hmm.
The next technology I want to present is battery storage. This was something that was not looked at in 2016. We had discussed in intervening years. A lot of investment has gone into batteries. Technology has improved significantly. Presently, lithium-ion is the predominant technology for battery storage technology. Lithium-ion batteries are being recycled. They're not the easiest to recycle, but the industry is aware of the implications of batteries coming in at the scale that they are now and have come up with plans to make recycling a little bit more readily available. Our analysis shows that there are no applications for standalone battery that is financially feasible. However, like in the instance of fuel cells, batteries can provide the extra value in the sort of sense of having emergency backup power. So that's another value stream that was not specifically included in our financial analysis. But this is something to continually look at. I think presently, if we were to say go forward with batteries or don't go forward, we probably lean towards, on a standalone basis, not to go forward, but as we've been reiterating over and over, the technology is improving, the value streams are starting to come on board. Presently, I'll show you in the next slide, the kind of value, the net present value for the project can be. But combining this with solar is another area to look at. A lot of projects are starting to come on board with solar plus storage, primarily because the ITC can also be applied, the investment tax credit can also be applied to the storage system when it's paired with solar. And the solar storage, or the storage market, is expected to double in size over the next year. So you're seeing a convergence of improvements in technology, reduction in costs. So it's something to keep an eye on moving forward. Here's the sites that we considered for battery storage. The reason we selected these sites is the difference in average demand versus maximum demand. So what we're trying to achieve is reducing the demand charge on your utility bill. And that's the primary value of energy storage, is to chop those peak periods off your bill, because that's where a significant amount of the cost for your facilities is accrued. And so as you can see, the PT-well and blending, there's a 300 kilowatt delta between your average demand and your maximum demand. And as you look down at the other sites we've looked at, you're looking at least 100 kilowatt demand difference, which we're aiming to shave using the battery storage system. But as you can see, using the PAYGO method and the CEC loan, there are no projects, no standalone battery projects that have a net present value that is positive. Again, this is something that should maintain monitoring, because the prices can change and there are other value streams that can come on board with battery storage.
So maybe this would be a good time to take a short break, Mr. President.
I agree.
Like maybe a 10-minute break before we go to the next slide and step into the light, so to speak.
So, 6 o'clock.
Okay.
We're going to have to go check this all out.
I probably can't get it anyway.
Yeah.
I'm sure the consultants want to see how
All right.
Okay, so moving on, right?
After the break, we're going to go into looking at solar. So here's a lot of information on this slide.
Can I actually ask a
Sure,
question?
yeah.
Just to clarify, so did you imply that the investment tax credit is only available if you do the battery storage with solar, and it's not applicable on just a standalone?
Oh, for battery storage, that's correct. So
Okay.
the batteries need to be charged by Renewable Energy in order for them to be, for the battery to be eligible for the investment tax credit. So here's the solar. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but first thing I want to just kind of show are the sites that we looked at. So we looked at 11 discrete sites, including Pit 1, Pit T1, and Pit T2, which we've already mentioned is a floating solar, along with the timing of the implementation. So over the course of our analysis, we looked at there's potential for almost 12 megawatts of solar capacity on district property, and the available area at each site. So with that in mind, I want to move on to the financial analysis slide to kind of give you a sense of what we looked at and which sites seem to pencil out. So we looked at each of these sites to determine the value that's being generated by the PV system. And again, if you recall, there's two streams of value coming from this. There's the offset value for offsetting the electricity that's being used at that particular site, and then there's the Res BCT, or the ResBEC generation credit value that's also being generated at most of these sites, so not necessarily all. And you can see the different value. So if you look towards the middle of the table, the different columns, there's the net present value under PAYGO, net present value under the CEC loan, and then the net present value under the PPA. And one of the key items, key takeaways, is that each project individually has a net present value positive under a PPA scenario. And under the CEC loan, you can see there's a couple of NAs not applicable. Again, if the project doesn't meet a 20-year payback, it is not eligible for the CEC loan. And there's a number of cases where the solar PV project does not meet that 20-year payback criteria. And under the PAYGO, there are a couple of projects that are net present value positive. And the key takeaway here is that we've come up with a representative PPA rate. And so we came up with that rate based on the expectation of a hypothetical developer and their rate of return, given the value stream of the investment tax credit, the accelerated depreciation, the PPA payments from the district, and this is what we reasonably expect a PPA provider to charge each of these individual sites.
I think there's one thing to point out then, that it is so sensitive to what proposers will offer you, because this is a marketplace and very competitive. There are a lot of companies really aggressive now in the solar business that will put in all the capital, build them. We've been talking with several companies. One of them has over 100 sites they've done. They did a project very similar to yours, two of them down in Southern California, using the power on-site plus ResBEC. They're very committed to that. So there's a good marketplace out there in the PPA world. Second thing I want to point out, though, is that the investment tax credit, as Ryan said, is shrinking. It's 30% if you start a project this year. You don't have to finish it or bring it into operation. It's 30%. It goes to 26% if you start it next year, then down to 22%, and then down to 10%. So there is kind of the sooner you get started on a project, the better the PPA rate is that you'll get from competitive companies.
So when I got to this slide, there was a question that came to mind. I'm just going to raise it. I know there are a lot of various issues that go into determining when we want to have a reservoir re-roof, age, proximity to the Hayward Fault, those kind of things. But when I looked at the payback period for Patterson Reservoir, it's 12 years, and it's the one reservoir we have pushed way out for re-roofing. You know, I thought to myself, well, why don't we go for where the biggest bang for the buck is, especially if we need to get started early, and maybe consider switching reservoirs around on our CIP. So I'm just going to raise it as a subject for future consideration or debate, but
yeah,
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and it's a reasonable question, and certainly things may change in terms of the planning, but as mentioned, Patterson in particular is subject to DSOD restrictions right now, and it may be that Patterson Reservoir doesn't exist as we know it today. It may be as a result of our work with DSOD that we replace that reservoir with a series of tanks, for instance. It may be that other things might happen up there, and so even though, I mean, this assumes that there is a reservoir up there with a big roof, and so this may not be what the future holds for Patterson, and so that's something that we definitely need to get worked out first.
We could just take out the reservoir and put in a solar field.
Panels. It would be good to have some storage up there.
I would appreciate it since I live in a neighborhood.
Just a review of our findings. So all the sites again, are under a net present value, under the third-party PPA owned scenario with a positive net present value. Many of the sites are also feasible under the pay-as-you-go process and also under the CEC loan. And as Michael had stated, the aggregation of projects is what's likely to generate the most competitive procurement process. And the more projects we could place in active procurement, the more likely we'll see the strongest developers show up with their most competitive bids. And just to keep that in mind as we kind of speak of our initial findings. And then I guess the last thing I wanted is a quick kind of shout out to the district staff. The 2016 original clean plan was very excellent. We kind of went over it with a fine-tooth comb, and there were some system sizes that varied a little bit, but for the most part, the findings that they came up with were kind of in line with our findings. So just wanted to make a note of that, and Shane was behind a lot of that, so thanks Shane for doing a great job and making kind of our job a little easier. And then, I guess financially, the PPA pathway is the best way forward for solar. And so the next item I want to look at is the solar plus storage.
And actually, Ryan, if you don't mind, I'd like to back up to that last one just for a second, because this is an important distinction between the trajectory that we're on right now, our prior planning, and the findings of MDB. And that is, as mentioned, what we had planned before was individual solar implementations over time, sort of opportunistically with the reservoirs as the roofs are replaced in other areas. But those would have been standalone, separate PPA agreements associated with each facility separately. And an important finding from this effort was that you get the most value if you can aggregate all of that solar together into one master or large PPA. And at that point, and MDB can explain this better than I can, but if you get beyond a certain threshold, 3.5 to 5, maybe more megawatts of total solar under one PPA, then you can really take advantage of some of the larger solar developers and the investment tax credits that they have amassed, or the tax credits that they can bring to the table. And you can also potentially get much better terms out of your PPA, rather than dealing with a smaller outfit, Jerry's Solar Service. And so that's a significant difference in terms of the approach that we had been taking, or that we had planned to take. Also from the district standpoint, ultimately we'd be working with one energy provider under that one contract, as opposed to, say, 5 or 6 under multiple contracts and multiple agreements with others. So from an administration standpoint, it might be a little bit more straightforward. But it does add a lot of complexity, because we're talking about one agreement that now spans multiple years and has to deal with all of the uncertainty that comes along with various facility implementations that occur over time, and then also all of the various feasibility issues. You mentioned CEQA, working with neighbors and permitting and all that. All of those include some level of uncertainty, and now we're talking about trying to work out contracts that deal with all of that way out into the future. And so it involves a different kind of effort and a little bit more quite a bit more upfront work than what we had anticipated sort of into this process. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's a significant difference in terms of approach. The end result is similar, better value under this approach, but it's a different approach, particularly in terms of contracting.
If I could just add to that.
I just want to clarify, so when you first presented the concept of aggregation, I thought we would be accelerating our capital project, but the intention is still to phase out within our capital improvement program, because the other facilities will come online as we do our capital project.
Correct. correct. I would be really careful about having the solar generation really drive the timing of the
That was the
CIP.
concern. Okay.
Right, exactly. You know, we've got our seismic improvement program mapped out. We've got, you know, the reservoirs themselves can't be taken offline at the same time. There's a timing issue and staggering and so forth. So, I'd be real hesitant to try and allow the solar generation aspect to really drive the CIP time.
So outside this whole financial viability, I do have concern about the PTA in the sense that we do not own the equipment, and it will be on top of one of our structures.
Mhm.
If we have to go and maintain it,
Right.
what rights do we have?
Right.
If we need to do emergency repair, if the regulation change,
Right.
what happens?
Right.
So that I would assume that would be part of the picture. It could be financially look very viable, but operationally, it just would not work out for us.
Right. Yeah, so we'll get there, but a key part of our next steps is going to have a lot to do. Should the board decide that this is, or agree that this is the right trajectory to be on, a key part of the next steps is to start developing that PPA and what it looks like. And we would certainly be very interested in building in all the protections that we need into that agreement. But that, again, it's a lot more complicated than our prior approach, because now you're really having to forecast the issues that will be at play over time. And so we'd have to be pretty careful about that process.
If I could just add, it is very different from what you have done in the past and the way you think about projects. It isn't different at all from what many agencies have done as they've gone into solar. In fact, this is standard. If we had this discussion 10 years ago, I would say, yes, all of those are big concerns. The timing, you don't want the solar developer to force you to change a roof out if you're not ready. All this. In the last 10 years, so many agencies have entered into PPAs with reputable, upstanding, well-financed companies. So there are standard procedures, standard legal terms that the industry has accepted that give you all of the protections. So what we would envision is like a master development agreement with a company selected competitively, yet you retain absolute and complete control over when a project, and it might list 5, 6, 8 projects in there, you have a written trigger before they can work on any of those. And so if you decide that this is project number 1, we're ready for it, that's fine. And if you want to wait on some of the others, then it would all be under the same agreement. Also, there would be a termination provision that if they didn't perform on the first one, there isn't going to be a second one or a third one. And the reason that this is kind of is ideal is because, particularly because the tax credits are shrinking now over time. This is the last year to get started. Lots of agencies across the country are sending out RFPs. The companies are deluged with all these RFPs. They don't know what's real, what's not, real opportunity, not real. To just put one out there, one project, I think would not get very much attention from the real, legitimate, good quality, Cadillac kind of developers that you want. So this idea of kind of an energy services agreement with a company, I think that showed the potential that we do have here, only committed perhaps one project at this time, I think would get their attention and at the same time safeguard you all the way along.
Michael, if we make a commitment, let's say for 5 meg or more right now, and the contractor is doing things in stages over a period of years, do they get the effective tax rate that is on the books right now, or is it declining over time as our projects are coming?
The latter. And it's interesting that in the old days, the investment tax credit measured the rate when you brought it online. And so the gold rush rate was quick. I got to get across the line and get it going. All the windmills in Altamont is involved in a lot of those. We had to, by midnight on December 31st of a certain year, they changed that rule. And it's when you start the project. And we've had several conversations with your staff about, even if you wanted a project which you budgeted next year or the year after, could it be started? And there are very specific IRS guidelines about what starting means. And we think there are ways that maybe not the latest one, you're way out there in 2025, 26, but that some of them further along could be started this year according to the IRS definition and capture that 30%. That's preserved. You've got until 2024 to bring it into service. You have to spend a certain amount of money or do certain things to do that. So were I in your shoes, I would think about accelerating getting the RFP out on the street, getting your company chosen, and having them spend enough money and jump through a few hurdles to put the stake in the ground for at least 1, 2, 3 of those projects at the 30% rate. When we showed you that it only cost them 50 cents on the dollar, that was assuming that nothing started this year and you were starting at the 26 and then going down from there. So that I think would be a great way to lock that in stone. Then you've got 5 years basically to actually implement the projects and get them rolling.
Thank you for that clarification.
Suggest that it's even a more fundamental change. This is the first time, maybe I was asleep at the wheel, that I've heard the term PPA used in this context of this part of our capital improvement program. Fundamental change in mindset. I was not a fan of our clean energy because it didn't make financial sense. We did not reach grid parity. It was a cost, and we were doing it to, quote, save the world. Sea level rise or whatever. It wasn't rational. This is a business deal. Now, if you think of it in terms of an enterprise effort, a separate enterprise function, now you've changed the context. It still doesn't make financial sense in real terms, but for the subsidized effect. So it's not a clean energy program, it's a subsidized energy program. And we're going to try and make a few bucks or save ourselves a few dollars in the long run by using this subsidized energy, sharing the cost savings with a private entity that we do not get as a public entity. Fine. But hopefully we get away from the mindset that we're out there doing clean energy and making it a sound business arrangement. And use it from a business perspective.
I think the goal here is to achieve both goals.
Well, I'm not as much of a fan as...
If we can have a sound business arrangement while, offsetting power and...
But the driver is that. I would argue it was not a sound business arrangement for this presentation.
Well, it's a sound business decision, if I might take exception, which is always dangerous for a consultant to exception to a board member.
But it's probably less dangerous for a consultant than a general
manager. It is the rules that we play by. When you pay your taxes are a little bit higher because the federal government is giving investment tax credit to people who are building solar next door. Similarly, when PG&E pays values power and at the peak period in ResBec at 26 cents, when it really only costs 8 or 10 to generate, that's going on all around you. City of Hayward's doing it right now. The gas project at their water treatment plant and at a solar field. So we are feeling the effects of those subsidies. You're paying for them. So my question is, why not use them if we're paying for them anyway? Isn't that part of the sound business?
We're in agreement, but I'm saying the investment into the solar, to me, when you didn't have grid parity, didn't make sense.
Let me add to what you're saying. It's not just the tax credits that are involved here. I've always advocated for going the PPA route because I believe in leveraging other people's money. And we get a benefit in return, and we also reduce our risk in the process. So I think it's a good deal all around.
Absolutely agree with you. And one other thing. So you leverage their money. Their money is being leveraged almost 50-50 by Uncle Sam. So you're getting double leverage. The other thing is that you get their expertise. These people, you guys full-time, your staff, make great water. Not great electricity. I mean, you do some of that, but that's not their expertise. You get a company, and if you get the right companies to propose, you get companies that really know what they're doing, and they don't make mistakes. They put things, they get through the CEQA process, air district, if there's air emissions, all that, work through all of the permitting, work through PG&E and all the complexities of ResBec, and it doesn't make your, doesn't eliminate completely what the board has to do, but it cuts it way down and certainly takes a lot of burden off the staff.
Let me quickly add on to the idea of an enterprise. So we have this, that our accounting system look at it as an enterprise effort, and that we then can keep track of our expenses and income, that we don't try and meld it into our normal operating budget, because it really is a separate account when we get into the PTA. When we have to go to accounts in sequence, but at least you now know how that contract is operating.
So just kind of to reinforce what Ed was talking about, that one of the key drivers of getting the best value for the district is the aggregation process. And we expect anything above 3 megawatts, preferably 5 megawatts, would really bring in the right developers and bring a very competitive procurement. As part of that procurement, we did look at PIT T1 and T2. Since it's probably the least certain of all the projects, our intent would be, we would recommend that the district include them as part of the procurement process, but also place a significant amount of the legwork on the developer to complete a more detailed feasibility of whether a PIT T1, T2 floating system could be workable, specifically regarding community impacts that may occur from visual impacts, additional environmental site review. These are a little bit, as you know, different than a rooftop of a reservoir, so certainly a little more evaluations required for those sites. And the other item that we wanted to recommend is looking at battery storage as an add-on as part of the procurement process. Again, battery storage as a standalone item does not work out financially, but including it as part of the solar package with the investment tax credit and the additional value streams that can occur from the operation of battery storage, shaving peak demand, shifting power usage to lower cost periods, it's worth placing in the procurement, or placing in the request for proposal and see what developers come up with.
A couple of developers are really trying to differentiate themselves from, Joe's Solar Shop by pairing batteries and solar and overlaying it with a very sophisticated controller system. So it's reading the PG&E system. It knows when power's worth $1 rather than 10 cents, and very, very sophisticated. So we believe that you would get some really, you get better proposals from companies if you allow them the option to put solar in as part of their initial proposal. Secondly, the way that even if you selected someone who didn't want to offer solar now, the way batteries are improving over time, and the climate for paying for the intrinsic value of it is so much that we would recommend you insist that at the very least the developer have the design it so that batteries could be added at a later date. It's not quite there yet for standalone, but it's definitely close, and we wouldn't want to see you guys move ahead without the provision for it, perhaps at a later date, not now.
Are inverters considered part of the battery storage side or the panel side?
Panel side.
Okay.
Yeah, the solar plus storage system, it would essentially be straddling that fence a little bit. In that, because the ITC does apply to the solar plus storage, it would be covered as part of the system.
We didn't really talk too much about photovoltaics. What are some of the requirements in terms of size or anything like that for it to be reasonable to implement photovoltaics?
So photovoltaics have photovoltaic, the floating solar, have primarily been installed by organizations that are a little bit more land constrained. So in the case the district may not necessarily fit in that type of customer for floating photovoltaics. But some of the key benefits of it are the surface of the water maintains a cooler temperature, so the modules produce higher amounts of electricity. So that's one of the key drivers. So you'll see the closest project that you could see is probably in Napa. There's a vineyard winery that has floating solar. They've had it for, I want to say, almost a decade. They're one of the first ones to have it installed. I mean, it's certainly not as well proven as a solar canopy in a parking lot that also provides shade for cars. So, but it's certainly something that I think warrants further investigation. There's also, we looked at the PG&E interconnection map. There's an interconnection point close by, which also helps with the economics of a project, such as that.
We've had a number of presentations at Aqua conferences on floating photovoltaics, in particular by a French company that's headquartered in Petaluma. I believe that they were the ones that installed the one in the winery, because they showcased it in their presentation. But they've done some very large industrial type applications as well. And the first time I saw that at a conference some years back, I brought it back here and I suggested we take a look at the quarry pits and pit 1 and 2, and there's all kinds of possibilities.
So floating solar may not fit like a glove here like it may in other areas, like the wineries and so forth, where they have very controlled land. Here, pits T1, T2, they're really uncontrolled sites. They're, of course, old quarry pits, and they are abutted by residential areas, some high-density residential in both cases. In the case of pit T2, there's also the railroad that goes immediately by there. We have concerns about slope stability along an entire, actually several parts of that pit. So there are lots of issues at play in terms of putting these in sort of this urban environment. But I think the thinking is the potential to generate power there, which would all be ResBEC power, by the way, because there is zero power demand on those sites. The potential here is at least worth looking at putting it out as part of an RFP for the PPA, and then, as MDB points out, have that solar developer do much of the legwork, do the feasibility evaluation, because it may work. It may not, but it may. And there are a lot of things that we'd have to consider before we would go down that road, but we didn't want to leave it off the table.
This table here shows the kind of proposed kind of sequence in which we would look at implementing solar projects. We have the first group of projects include Whitfield and May Reservoir, which has its roof already replaced. Desalination, there's no roof replacement required, and then part of headquarters, because we could work on the solar canopies without having to worry about any kind of roof replacement. So that's about 2 megawatts of total capacity. The next grouping of projects are the ones that require roof replacement, but in kind of the relatively near term, headquarters phase 2, Dakota, Alameda, and then the next grouping is pit T1, T2, and as we discussed, requires a little further evaluation to see the feasibility of those projects. And then the possible future sites, as mentioned before, Patterson and Middlefield have a little more uncertainty, and keep that kind of on the board, but not one of the higher priority projects. So our initial conclusions, kind of just wrapping up to cover all the technologies looked at. So we looked at wind. It's not feasible, primarily due to the low wind resource at Patterson. and also the level of effort required by the district in order to determine both its environmental feasibility and also the local neighbors' visual concerns that may be present there. Hydro, we've determined to not be worth pursuing at this time. We recommend keep monitoring the hydro energy recovery equipment as there are technologies kind of coming on board, especially on the low head, high flow side. So something maybe new technologies may provide a solution there in the near future. Fuel cells is the one where right now it's kind of on in between, as Michael had stated before. It's not technology we're strongly behind. It's not technology we want to fully exclude, but there are a number of considerations to keep in mind. Primarily the natural gas pricing risk is the key one there, and trying to see how the value of having emergency backup power and how that kind of fits into the overall view of fuel cells as a technology. And then lastly, the standalone battery. Presently, it doesn't quite pencil out on the net present value side, but as Michael mentioned and as we've repeated a number of times, it's worth considering including in an RFP for the solar and combining solar plus storage to extract additional value from that sort of project. And this last slide kind of is a table that covers kind of in general some of the efforts that the district has made on the self-generation side and how much power that comes from those, and then our view of the near-term sites, roof replacement sites, etc. So presently, the treatment plant hydro produces about 1.5 million kilowatt hours a year. The near-term sites that we mentioned, which include Whitfield, Mayhew, DeSalle, and the headquarters phase 1 is about 3.6 million. The next set of roof replacement solar sites is another 4.5 million. PIT T1 and T2 PIT T1 adds another 3 million. So you're looking at 12.6 million kilowatt hours produced out of the total that the district uses, which is about 16.5 million. So you can look at about 75% of generation charges being offset through the ResBEC program. And I want to strongly caution that that does not mean 75% of your energy bill is canceled out. It's just the generation charge. So this does not include your demand charges, your distribution charges. So it offsets a non-insignificant portion of the bill, but keep in mind that there are other electricity or utility charges that are also part of that bill. And that's all the slides I have.
So if we included PIT 2, which I'm not saying to support right now, but with the numbers you gave us, we could have almost 100% of our annual usage covered. Fantasy world.
Yeah, you'd get closer, I think you'd get just over 80% or something along those lines if you included both pits.
You get another 3.7 megawatts on PIT 2.
Yeah, it looks like you'd get to about 15.6 compared to 16.5. So yeah, nearly 90+% of generation charges would be covered. Yeah.
So that's of generation charges,
right,
though, not of actual power.
Not of total utility bill, right.
3.7 on top of 12.6 is 16.3.
Well, 3.7, yeah, you're right.
So you're almost at 100%.
But not part of your presentation are one of your options. And you mentioned Hayward, where you actually are doing, as I understand, converting gas to power in a power plant. And when I was on the community college board at Lundy College, we were approached by Calpine because we had a 36-inch gas main adjacent to crossing a high voltage power lines, and they thought that might be a great location to generate power. You're converting gas and pumping it into the grid. If that scenario were to exist on or near our facilities, might that be yet another alternative we could look at in a public partnership agreement and then capture some real money. Or
Yes,
significant
just to
money.
clarify, Haywood is not using natural gas, so they're using the sewage the gas produced.
The sewage treatment facility.
plant. But the scenario you laid out, yeah, if you own a piece of property that has the crossroads of a power line and a natural gas line, there's potential projects that could be developed around that.
What is the example you're thinking
Well,
about?
Maloney College had it, but I don't know, we'd have to take a look at our geography and what lands we have or might acquire, and to be able to become the host of a power generation facility that takes the lower cost natural gas, which I believe will be in the future, and converts it to higher cost electricity. Higher
So you
value
want to go into the
electricity.
power business?
Well, we're talking about going into the power business with the PPA. I'm just expanding on that concept.
Okay.
Other questions for Ryan or Michael?
Is it permitted by the county water act?
Well, that's a good question for the attorney. Can
We have to look into that.
business?
We have to look into that. That's the direction of the board as a policy matter.
I'm asking that question seriously, Pat.
Yeah, no, and I'm serious too. I don't know off the top of my
Yeah.
head. I'd have to look at that.
So that might be a complex, little investigative effort. Would cost a few dollars. We would want clear direction from the board that that would be what you're interested in.
Yeah.
Well, if we're going to be selling the power off grid, or how do you differentiate that from being in the power business? It's a fundamental question to us. Is this PPA allowed under
The PPA,
legislation?
we're just offsetting our own costs.
Oh, no, we're selling power to the real world.
Plus, if I have to guess, those plants, when Calpine approach you, it would be a gas turbine generation plant. Those plants generally are used as peaker plants because it's actually more expensive than conventional generation methods.
That was one of the
So-
concepts. The other problem you have, as you pointed, and hopefully we recognize, is that peaking is going away. With all the solar kicking in, we're seeing the flattening of the curve, and maybe even a complete reversal.
So my
in the
point
dip.
is, that might not pencil out, therefore maybe we should not go there.
You may not want to go into this
Because it
clean
is
power
expensive
business at
power.
all, because it doesn't make financial sense yet. We don't have grid parity.
Anyway, I don't think we should go into power generation, so I don't think it's worth the look.
Well,
So we got one opinion.
when we defined the agenda today, it was a relatively narrow focus. And so I think what we should probably do is kind of complete the presentation and see where we are on the topics du jour. And if the board is interested in, expanding or looking at different topics or doing some additional research, staff serves as the board's pleasure.
All right, so, conclusions and approach to next steps. So where are we right now? So tonight we've seen that we're already realizing significant savings from past and current operations and energy efficiency initiatives. We've seen that our 2016 Clean Energy Alternatives Evaluation still generally holds. We've seen that the preliminary CIP, or at least the pieces that we looked at tonight, are consistent with our strategic plan for clean energy initiatives. So staff's approach, based upon the discussion tonight, staff's approach would be as is laid out here. So what we'd be looking at is continuing to move forward in the direction of renewable energy generation, basically solar at this point, with optional battery storage as discussed. We wouldn't propose to modify the CIP project timing based upon the potential to generate electricity along with a number of capital projects. But we would propose that we go ahead and do this one PPA, it's a very large PPA up front, put it out on the street and see what we get. And to include that PPA, we'd look to include Whitfield. We look to include Mayhew, the desalination facility, and headquarters phase 1, which is basically everything that's not a roof, right? It's headquarters phase 1. And again, you can see the little asterisks next to each project that's not the very first one to go, and then those asterisks are intended to indicate that we would structure this so that if we don't like how it's going, we have an off-ramp. Also included in that one big PPA, we would look to include headquarters phase 2, that's basically the roofs. Dakota Reservoir and Alameda Reservoir, as those reservoir roofs are structurally upgraded. And then we discussed pits T1 and T2, have the feasibility evaluations that are still required. We include them in the PPA to see what we get back from the market, essentially. So, and again, in terms of lower certainty sites, we have Patterson and Middlefield. Our initial thinking is we keep those out of the initial PPA just because of the uncertainty issues associated with those sites. But it's not as though they're not potential future sites, it's just we wouldn't focus on them in the initial PPA. So that's essentially the content of the power purchase agreement that we propose to put out onto the market. Yes, sir.
Quick question for our consultant. Can you help us understand, put in perspective for us, how a 5 to 10 megawatt project for a district like ours would compare in the county or around the Bay Area? Would this be among one of the larger projects, or where would it rank?
I would say it's kind of in the middle. It's in the pretty typical. For example, Hayward's project is 1 megawatt, and they're planning another megawatt. Ryan, anything you're working on BART and others?
Yep. BART has enough. It would also be smaller. Alameda County as a county. I think in Alameda County, for a particular agency, this would be one of the larger collective procurements.
That's what I was thinking, because just driving around the Bay Area, I don't see that many very large facilities. We happen to have a lot of real estate footprint available, so I think this may be could be one of the largest in at least our county.
In accumulation, and if you take the pits out, they're all like a megawatt and a half down, and those are pretty typical, and I think the lowest is 120. So there's a lot of those in your size. On a project-by-project basis, you're not doing anything unusual. Yet, grouping them all together, that's why you'll get good response, we believe, from the PPA providers when they say, wow, we got 10, 11 megawatts there of potential business. And yet we can put in discrete modules that are well within the typical size range of urban area projects. Mm-hmm. Now, you'll be very attractive. That's why we, I guess, pressed this with your staff to bring forward this change in the way you're thinking of things rather than project by project, just to really elevate yourself to a place where you're going to be the desired company, agency for the companies to win the contract.
If I could take one exception to our summary here. I question validity of our 2016 CIP. Absent, maybe the PPA will make it economically viable. I don't think currently solar is economically viable for public entities that do not have the advantages of the other games and tricks of tax credits, etc. So,
yeah, in Shane's defense, I will stretch back in time to 2016, and we evaluated both. PAYGO, we evaluated PPA, and our recommendation was PPA.
In 2016?
2016.
I didn't recall.
Yeah, that was because we got that value from the investment tax credit.
Yeah, it was evolved.
Okay, so in order to go down that road, this is essentially what staff thinks it looks like. The prospect got a little bit more complicated when we started talking about a very large PPA, and we're doing all this up front. Oops. So what we would propose is, we're not energy experts, so we would go back out onto the market and we would solicit the services of a energy consultant to help us do a few things. We didn't talk a whole lot about the RESBIT program and all the intricacies of that, but part of what we feel we need to do is take a look at both generating sites and receiving sites or benefiting sites, and make sure that as we're generating power at all of these different sites, that we have adequate receiving capacity at the various benefiting sites to make sure that we're making use of every kilowatt that we're generating throughout the system. So, so our thought is take another look at that mapping between generating and consuming or benefiting sites. Also, develop the scope of the work and the terms for this PPA. Right, so that's what we see as the significant effort. And then we're looking for support in terms of the PPA procurement process to help negotiate the terms. We expect, based upon our understanding, that we can get a lot of variability back from the market from this process, from different solar developers. And we're looking at going through a relatively complex procurement process, which has me conjuring up images of the AMI procurement that we're doing right now, which is obviously a great deal of effort. So we're looking for assistance with the PPA procurement process, and then potentially even over time serving as the district's representative in terms of the actual implementation.
If I can make one more suggestion, that given the rapidity of the technology, that we include in the PPA procurement the option for people to propose fuel cell and battery technologies. But we keep that as one of the things we would entertain.
Certainly batteries, that's in line with our current thinking. In terms of fuel cells, it's my understanding it's likely that the PPA provider for a fuel cell system would be a different entity than the provider for a solar system. It's probably more appropriate to put out two separate RFPs for those two technologies, but it's something we can further discuss. It'll get that much more complicated if we're doing multiple large RFPs, and we've seen that the likely benefits of the fuel cell system may not be a slam dunk at this point. So staff's thinking is we'd limit it to solar and battery for now, and then consider other options in the future.
Why don't we consider that other alternative fuel cells after we have a second workshop, follow-up workshop?
So, Ed, I have a quick question on this matter. How big are fuel cells? How much real estate do they require?
It's a good question, and we have the answer to that.
Are there two of them in this room? Three.
They're pretty large.
How much about the size of a shipping container for a 200 kW? You could probably put 3.
Yeah, about the size of this room for the 600 kilowatt.
Well, maybe on sites that were more land constrained, it might be something to consider for emergency operations or something like that.
Yeah,
Far less real estate than solar.
Right.
I do agree with Mr. Stevenson that it should be a separate process. You'll send kind of conflicting messages, I believe, out to a primarily solar battery company, and they'll go, well, what's this fuel cell thing? We don't do that. And similarly, the fuel cell people will say, well, we don't really do solar. You'll get much better response having two parallel processes. And I think that'll just get you better commercial response to your RFP.
Does Michael D. Brown define yourself as an energy engineer procurement consultant as well as your other activities?
Well, I'm not sure we have any other activities. That is what we do.
So we would be potentially rebidding for services that you may end up doing the follow-up.
We would be pleased to receive the request for proposals and respond appropriately.
Yeah, this clearly wasn't in MDB's scope of work. It wasn't included in the RFP that we put out for the services that we're benefiting from tonight. So this would go back out into the market.
Do we have to go back out for an RFP?
Should. Yeah, in accordance with the board's procurement policy, we would do that.
Mr. Stevenson,
Yes, sir.
assuming we go forward with the next steps as proposed, about when would the board see something again, and what would they be seeing?
That's a great question, and it'll lead on to my next bullet here, which is, so by, essentially now we're dealing with two procurements, one for the services of the consultant, and one ultimately complex PPA procurement. So we know we're set back by about 4 months now to do the larger procurement. So we would actually want to get started a little bit earlier than we were originally planning. And in terms of the Whitfield only alternative this coming fiscal year. So it's likely we would, pending the results of this discussion tonight, we'd be at work pretty quickly putting together the RFP for consulting services. And then, so the board would next see that contract, and that may be as early as, say, July. We might even be able to get it earlier than that, but that might be a little aggressive. I'd say that's very aggressive. And then following that, they would have a good deal of work to do to prepare the RFP for going out to the market. So that would be next fall sometime at the earliest is my guess that we'd see a large procurement for a PPA.
The reason I asked whether you necessarily have to go out for another RFP is because I'm thinking of the time consideration here and trying to make sure that the potential responses from the developers where they could act on, you know, the 30% tax credit and everything in a timely way, because they're already going to be inundated. So can we make an exception that says, hey, the consultant that we've used so far has a certain knowledge base with all of our facilities and work done to date, so you can go ahead and just negotiate that contract.
So if I may step in, this is something that if we hear from the board this evening, essentially time is of the essence because of these kind of issues that you brought up. Staff will talk internally. There are things that we can do to accelerate processes, but now's not the appropriate time. You know, so I would want to huddle with staff and council, and we'll come up with something that moves the project along as quickly as possible. If that is,
well, you're hearing from one director that I think time is of the essence.
Yeah, as long as it makes sound business case and we know that we're getting good value for what we're spending, that would be a primary consideration, but there are things we can do.
And I would think that the dollar amount, wouldn't it be under the general manager's?
Well, let me talk with staff internally again. You know, our consultant is here right now.
Would you like us to leave?
No.
I understand I'm walking a fine line.
No, it's okay because I would need to talk to my own staff but the question is yes. The answer to the question is yes, there are things we can do.
And my clarification that the PPA is part of the critical path to doing any of our solar projects. We're now not do solar absent a PPA.
I think you heard this evening that the PPA approach is the most financially beneficial to the district.
Considered to be the only economically viable.
I don't believe that was the outcome the last time we discussed this, or the time before that. I think the first time we discussed it, if I remember correctly, I am trying to go back a few years, it barely penciled out on the projects we were looking at. However, it was almost at range. the last time we penciled this out, and we discussed PPAs on each time, not to the same scope, if I remember correctly. But I have a differing memory, I guess, on that, so I'll just leave it at 1-to-1.
I have one remaining kind of technical question. When it came to reviewing Winfield Reservoir, and I'm sure you have a good answer here, why are we not looking at utilizing the entire landscape there instead of just a portion of the property on the non-roof side? Why wouldn't we use the roof side as well?
Good question, and I'll let the team correct me, but essentially we looked at both. I think both are an option. The thinking has been that our options could include using the majority of the site. We would want some perimeter around the site and so forth, not to be necessarily used, but if using the majority of the site is a potential option. A fixed tilt system might be more appropriate if we were to place a system, an array of panels over the reservoir, and then an actuated tilting system may be appropriate for the remainder of the site. So we looked at both, and neither are out of the question, but certainly initially we only looked at the non-reservoir portion simply to minimize any sort of issues related to interference with the structure and access to the reservoir itself.
Is it conceivable that you could double the kilowatt generation from about 1.2 up to 2 or higher?
Yeah, I don't know that double, but I'll certainly turn it over to the team.
Well, I can just tell you on that.
In the non-reservoir area, we showed at 640 kilowatts, and the reservoir area at 460. So 2/3, 1/3. You get another 50% by using the reservoir, more than 50%.
Yeah.
And this could be in the RFP shown as 2 phases at the district's control. You could say yes on the non-reservoir area, and we'll get back to you, and it is in your scope of work and contract when and if we decide to do the reservoir, then you're the ones that will get that.
The first bullet point under the next steps are the master plan for mapping. That is a key component of this, mapping which sites can accept RESPEC. There's requirements and conditions involved with that. You can't just generate a ton of power and then use it all at one site, for example. So we'll need to review all of those different alternatives. Some sites may become more effective than others as a result of that.
So Winfield was built, as I recall, in the early 90s, right?
Mid-80s.
Mid-80s? Okay. When is it on our CIP horizon for a roof replacement there?
Never.
For Whitfield?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a concrete structure. There's no roof to replace or maintain.
There was one time a proposal to put tennis courts on the roof of Winfield Reservoir. Come on, let's go back that far.
Yeah, so the roof itself is reinforced concrete on columns. It's got a waterproof sort of coating on top of the concrete, and then there's between 1 foot and 18 inches of earth on top of the reservoir itself. So one concern is we would just need to be very careful about it. We wouldn't want to do anything that would allow for any, say, leaks into the reservoir. So that would just be an issue.
So I was wondering if maybe one reason you didn't look at the roof side was to support the large solar arrays, you have to embed that deep enough so it's structurally sound, it's not blowing over in the wind and things like that. I saw how USD put in their facility down the road here on Fremont Boulevard, and it's actually pretty heavy, you know, what you're structural stuff that you're...
Yeah, so that would obviously be an issue to look at the sort of the loading on the reservoir itself.
But I just want to clarify, if I could, we did look at the roof, and on one of the charts here, it shows it, here's the reservoir area, and here's the non-reservoir, and we did recommend, if you wanted to do the reservoir, not to put a tracking system on it, which not only adds the static load, it adds the dynamic load as well, and that's why we differentiated that. It would take a good structural analysis to figure out if there's any problem. My hunch, and it's after being an engineer and doing this for over 30 years, is it would support just fine a static system, and you might get yourself in trouble with a tracking system.
Great, thank you for answering that.
I can tell you with empirical data that it can support a pickup truck.
I'm sorry?
Because I saw it.
Okay, so...
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Going back to timeline, considering, or once all is signed and contractors ready to go, how long would it take for them to complete enough work to meet the IRS's quote-unquote like project has started criteria so that we could take advantage of the 30% tax credit before the end of the year for all the near-term projects?
That's an excellent question, and I asked a couple of the developers to give me that feedback. There was recently, it's not clear in the law, as most laws, federal laws are. There was an interpretive letter from the IRS that says, here's what you have to do to be considered begun construction. And one of those was to, and it's a little vague, was to spend or commit to spend at least 5% of the total cost of the project. So the idea that I've tried out with a couple of the attorneys for the developers is one of the things that somebody's going to have to go through, either the district or the developer on behalf of the district, is the interconnection with PG&E. And that will likely be 5% or more of the total cost. There's a process that takes about 6 months to get an interconnection agreement. That agreement is a legal obligation to spend a certain amount of, to pay PG&E a certain amount of money, and in fact, the district, or by then the developer, would have to escrow that money into a joint PG&E district or joint PG&E development. And so I asked the attorneys that I deal with, would that count and meet that rule? Because that seems like it's a very easy way to commit. And they said, like your answer, Pat, it depends. And I'm going to start the meter, and these guys charge $7.50 to $9.95 an hour. So I didn't get the definitive statement on that. There's very few attorneys. There's some attorneys in Washington, D.C. and other places that specialize in that one very narrow question of what constitutes that. So I would say if a project is, let's say, $3 million, 5% is $150,000. Somebody has to spend or commit to spend $150,000 before the end of the year, and it would have to be the developer, or it could be the district, who then assigns that and gets reimbursed from the developer. So I think it's quite possible to get at least a couple of those interconnection agreements going very quickly. You might even add that to your bullet point, is for the district to start the interconnection, because that doesn't matter what developer you pick. And in fact, if you say to the developers, we've already started the interconnection agreement process, the first step is PG&E, you pay them $800, they do a little study and they say, yeah, this is, you can interconnect. That would strengthen you in the commercial marketplace. The developers would say, ACWD is serious. They're really going to do this. Let's go after it rather than let's put it in the back burner. So I think that might be a really good approach that would you'd spend a little bit of money in a couple thousand per site, and could perhaps secure that 30% for all the projects that should be done before 2024.
So you kind of actually answered my follow-up question, which is if we could start that process before choosing a developer.
Yeah, we did that exact thing for USD. There was year before last, there was a thing where PG&E tried very hard to kill solar by changing the time of use, which they did end up succeeding in doing. Used to be you could get the peak hours were much more of the total hours of the year, and they've shifted that. So the Public Utilities Commission said to PG&E, okay, we'll let you change time of use, but for local governments who get their applications in, prove they're serious, we'll give you a pass. We'll grandfather them in. And so we did for a number of clients, including USD. We quickly put those in, got them in before December 31st. And so it's a pretty simple process, and that's totally independent of whether you did it yourself, the project, or picked a developer, and if you pick a developer, of who the developer is.
Okay.
So I have a question, follow up on that same line of discussion. So we've had some recent experience that's not so pleasant with PG&E because of the bankruptcy and their willingness to work with us and the timeliness of them responding to our requests and so forth. And so do you have a sense on what the risk would be that we start this, but because of PG&E's financial situation and maybe lack of resources, that this might not be the best approach and we'd be better off looking at a different 5% to spend?
Well, we should definitely think about it some more. Fortunately for this situation, the Public Utilities Commission mandated specific time frames. So you can read it in the tariff on behalf of the Assembly. It says within 10, and I'm making up the numbers, but this is in the right ballpark. Within 10 days of receipt of your complete application, PG&E must review it and get back to you if there's anything missing. Within 20 days of a completed application, PG&E must complete the study and submit it back. So they would be in really serious violation of Public Utility Commission laws or regulations. So I think in this case, unlike some other things that are going on at PG&E, you'd be pretty secure that it would just move right ahead. They've taken it to 11:59 on a few of the 10 and 20 days things with us, but they've always come through.
Well, this is going to take some time to design, and then before you start construction, so it'll be interesting to see at what point the commitment is. But this is truly a partnership. We're the district, which has some modest assets, as well as the land, to commit that to the separate entity, I call it an enterprise effort. Might that qualify to meet the deadline by December 31st?
I think it's a spending test. They want to see receipts or contracts that you will pay something. So I don't think an asset commitment can do it. And I don't know the answer. I mean, clearly, if we're your selected consultant, we'll include getting counsel from, if your legal counsel has that expertise in-house or from one of these specialists on that, and come back to you with, here's the best way to preserve that 30%.
If we set up a separate account where we took a portion of our reserves and put it toward that, the threshold dollar amount, again, to meet that the timeline.
Most of the people are doing it by buying some panels. They figure, well, I know I'm going to use 5% of the panels, and so they'll put an order in, and they'll put 10% down on the order with a 5% cancel, 5% down in a cancellation policy. So that's the easy way to do it, is just order some panels this year. There are some people sitting on panels that haven't, some companies sitting on panels that haven't been called on, so there's some good deals out there on panels, and you could just sort of pre-buy a bunch of panels, figure no matter what you're going to use 5% of the total number of panels. That's another way to do it.
Well, it's the developer that's taking the risk, not us, on the panels.
Well, what I'm concerned about is how long it will take you to get the developer. And when we had the conversation, which you also brought up about, do you really have to go out and do an RFP to get us? It partly is out of self-interest, because we'd really love to do this work with you guys, but also because if you take 3 or 4 months to hire your consultant, and takes 3 or 4 more months to get somebody online, now it's January. I couldn't see how you could do that you may have solved with your suggestions and what Mr. Shaver was talking about. Maybe we can streamline that. What I liked about the interconnection is that it's not very much money, and you can get it started tomorrow. And show that well before the end of this year, you have signed a legal obligation to escrow some money to pay for PG&E side and pay interconnection, and then you just assign that agreement to the selected developer.
Yeah, I would add that that there will be time required to put together that big PPA, right? As discussed, it'll be complicated. This agency does need to be careful with that. It's a long-term commitment, and there are big dollars at risk. We saw some of the numbers, 38 million. So we do need to be careful about it. We're certainly interested in keeping all of our doors open and moving forward briskly. We do need to recognize we have to be careful. The numbers that you saw in terms of solar value were based upon the 26%, not the 30% for that reason. If there are tools that we can use to capture the 30% or the most value, of course, that would be our strategy. But I just want to note that our intent is to be careful in this large PPA.
And next year it goes from 30 to 28?
26.
26.
And then to 22, and then to 10.
And the assumptions that we saw this evening are all based on 26.
On 26, right.
So 26 and less.
And less depending on implementation year?
Correct.
I have one question for Mr. Wanderler on the financing side of this. What do you think about the idea of putting forward like a clean energy bond, a revenue bond, to finance these activities? Is it something worth looking at?
Well, the way the PPA is set up, we're relying on the contractor to do the financing, and that benefits us because the tax credit's available to them for this kind of project. So we're not actually fronting the capital money. If that kind of structure didn't exist and there weren't the tax credits and we thought our own financing was the ideal approach, then that's something where we get with our financial advisor and see what sort of benefits may be available to that type of financing approach. But based on what has been presented this evening, I think the approach is we're not the ones raising the capital. The contractor is taking that risk on, and we are paying a price certain based on their proposal for the energy that we would buy through that contract.
So it's essentially a very little cash down proposition.
Right.
And the part of the game that's for us is the price certain reduced power costs.
I didn't ask my question as clearly as I should have. It's getting late. We have a choice between a PPA and doing it ourselves, right? If we did it ourselves, my understanding is part of the trade-off is you actually have a higher rate of return if you own the units because you're sharing on the PPA agreement. They have to benefit also from what's going on financially.
Yeah, that's right. So they usually they make a pretty good return.
Yeah, it's not just on the tax credits.
Right.
It's more than that.
But when our consultants took a look at it and ran the numbers, they compared three options. One is we pay as we go, just we cash fund. The other was a 1% interest California Energy Commission loan, which would be better than anything we could get on our own going to market. And then the PPA was the third alternative. And essentially what the net present value analysis showed is that the value of those tax credits, even with the rate of return that these companies will make, the value of the tax credits is such that that's still better than even a 1% loan from the Energy Commission.
10.
And they're the ones receiving the tax credits, not...
Right, but that pricing is factored
Right.
into what they'll sell us the power
Yeah,
for.
I just want to make that clear, we're not getting the tax
Correct.
credits.
Yeah, because we don't pay
Yeah, we-
income tax
Right.
as an organization.
Okay, I think we're, all right, I don't know if we're close to wrapping it up or not, but I think, have we given staff the answers that you need? And if not, what do you need answered?
Appreciate the question. So, and I also appreciate all of the questions and the discussion all along. And we frankly expected nothing less from you all. Essentially, based upon the discussion tonight, I have not heard a reason to not continue down this path. We don't know precisely what we'll bring back to the board or precisely when. As you know, there'll be additional discussion about the way forward. But based upon our discussion tonight, I think we're moving forward as generally as what the board saw. We do have a number of other items that we want to follow up on and make sure that what we've heard from you is being addressed. But I think we have heard what we need to hear from the board in terms of this topic, and I think we would continue to move forward.
Okay, well, then, to wrap, I guess we can put a wrap on it. Director Weed, further comments?
I'll save them until after the meeting.
Sethy?
Just briefly, I proposed 6 months at one of our board meetings that we do a comprehensive review of all of our energy usage and any clean energy opportunities. I proposed a workshop or two, and I mentioned to Mr. Shaver yesterday after going through the presentation that first of all, I thought it was absolutely excellent. There was a tremendous amount of work done by staff, our consultant. It way exceeded my expectations for what I thought might come out of a workshop. It also exceeded my expectations on the clear benefits and potential cost savings, because we had noted that in that board meeting 6 months ago that 5% of our O&M costs are related to energy. And so I was, I've argued that if we could just simply reduce it by 1% or 2%, it factors in long term into all your financials. So I'm really happy to see that there are some really good opportunities for us to go after here and roll out over the next decade. I also want to mention that I think there's some tremendous PR communication opportunities for the district, and you see it with districts at Aqua that are promoting going zero emissions, lowering their carbon footprint. They're putting it on their websites, that they're, this is the drive to become a clean energy water district. They're talking about the energy water nexus to educate the public about why this is important, that we reduce these energy costs. And so one reason I asked the question about the size of our project compared to other things going on in the county is I think we can ham this up a little bit, to our own service area, our customers, that we're doing one of the most important projects potentially in the Bay Area, in your community, and it should feel like a little bit of a reward for our customers. We're investing in this through your rates, but it's also going to help us lower or discount any future rating on the community. So I think all those are really important, and I am very excited.
Well, I think Director Sethy summed it up quite well. I think the business case here is very well laid out, and I'm also excited for the opportunities that we have here. So I want to thank staff and our consultants for an excellent presentation. I think it's also great that it coincided with Earth Day almost, considering the most.
By the way, I went green today. Go green.
Yeah, I'm excited. So looking forward to what comes next with our results.
Well, I will echo what Director Akbari and Director Sethy said. Great presentation. I love the financial analysis, and Shane, it's good to have your 2016 analysis validated. Great job. You did such a great job that you actually convinced me. I'm always very, very comfortable with the concept of a PTA. The whole concept of having some analysis equipment on our property that would limit how we could use our property always bothered me. And I am convinced on the financial note, but I will be looking at staff to make sure that whatever we put in will not interfere with how we operate and our need to deliver safe and clean water. Because there are just way too many examples of good intentions that got sideways. Thank you.
One, I'd like to thank the staff and consultant. This has been a lot of work. We've been talking about it for a few years. We kind of put it on hold during the drought time. Money was a problem. I think money was tight. I think Director Sethy's concept of playing the PR can be very useful. There's a lot of permitting that's going to be necessary. There may be issues with the neighbors. Well, I don't think anybody's going to want to oppose this project, or certainly be in a position to be delaying this project. And I think by making a little bit of a PR, we help drive that fact home. In fact, we might want to contact the city or the cities, I'm not sure how much this is in Newark, and let them know this is coming. We're going to be, but we have to do it fast. And, you know, we write a problem. We have to do it fast because it's going to cost us money. That's our ratepayers' money. That's your residents' money. Please help us. I don't see a big neighborhood pushback. I'll say it on camera, I don't care. If they want to push back, feel free to come down to the district. I have no problem with that. We've had stuff across the country recently, you know, I mean global warming, whether you agree with it or not, I'm not even one of those. But this is not new technology. PPAs are not new. I've been dealing with solar since I was a senior in college. Coast Guard's had solar since the 1980s. This is nothing new. What is new is the payback. A lot of what the Coast Guard was using it for was areas that it was really made intelligent sense. But there's no new technology here. The PPA is not a new concept. I thought the engineers were going to run out of the room for a minute here, but this is going to be a lot of work. This is going to be a tremendous amount of work. Throw this on top of AMI and everything else you got to do, I worry about enough time. Which is one of the reasons I kind of like the PPA concept. I appreciate your stepping up and trying to make it happen. I've been a supporter all along, so obviously, you know, I think most of you know that. But I get nervous when we're starting to throw another project on top of you when you already got multiples. So I appreciate you didn't run out of the room. You know, your efforts are greatly appreciated. I understand. We are under kind of a time gun here. If we can make it, we could save some money, and I think that's important. And as far as clean energy goes, I think it's good. It doesn't hurt anything. I don't think this hurts anything. It only helps. So whether or not we're a believer in global warming or green power or the Green Deal, we should be going this direction. at least partly. What harm is it? We could probably save ourselves some pretty good money. So with that, I guess we can call this meeting to a close. I think staff has what they need. General manager report, after all is?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, but I do believe that energy, item 4, energy conservation and clean energy programs, we're good.
Okay.
So thank you for your attention.
General manager's report.
So I do have a couple of general manager reports. Wanted to make the board aware that something called AB 217, the Safe Drinking Water for All Act, is now crystallizing. And it's co-authored by Assembly members Garcia and Rubio. And the second tier of authors, Assembly member Quirk, is also an author. And what this bill is sort of a different take on the water tax. So what it would become is a state water board administered program, initially starting out at 50 cents per customer per year as a fee that the district would pay the state water board. Then the state water board is required to deposit the proceeds, this revenue, into a fund which has limitations on what the fund can be used for. The fund is called the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Trust Fund. And the goal is to get to a point where there's about $3 billion in the fund and utilize about $100 million in interest that the fund collects to fund the projects and the programs that are needed in the Central Valley and the Salinas Valley to provide safe and reliable water service to those disadvantaged communities in those areas. And the bill also has language in it that 50 cents fee gets reviewed annually. So there's really no limit in terms of what it can morph into. But the goal is to get the $3 billion in 5 years by January 2023. There's other aspects to the bill that's similar to the water tax bill, which involves a fertilizer tax and a milk tax. I haven't looked at the details of those, but I would assume it's pretty similar. And so what's interesting is that the district is being asked to sign on to various coalitions or to take a particular position on this bill, which the board has already taken a position on the water tax. But given that one of our local assembly members has kind of signed on to this bill and knows the district's position, because your board president, myself, and Ron Davis already met with Assembly Member Quirk in Sacramento previously on the water tax bill. I thought that this would be not necessarily a good discussion item because it's not on the agenda, but I would throw out that my instinct, unless informed otherwise, would be to kind of step aside on this, maybe get involved in coalitions, but if I can do that in the near term, so sign on to an Aqua Coalition bill or whatever, we could do nothing because that might be perceived by our local assembly member as some sort of slight, or I can bring this to the I can do nothing and bring this to the May 2nd board meeting to allow the board to have a discussion about what we want to do with AB 217. So my instinct tells me to sort of chill until I get an opportunity to come back to the full board. And unless I hear that that's instinct, because something can happen quickly, because I'm sure that this bill is consistent with what the governor wants. Otherwise, Mr. Quirk probably, he knows ACWD's position, and we represent many of his constituents. So I guess I'm saying I'm chilling unless I hear otherwise, for now. And I will put it on the agenda for May 2nd.
I think that's a great idea. I would ask you to also provide us with more detail once it's more crystallized.
I have the language of the bill, so I'd be happy
Right.
to
You know, we have
forward that to the board.
specific concerns regarding the water tag. That's not a concept that we object to. Right, so send us a bill, we'll bring it back.
Okay. Thank you. The second item, just so that you know, and it's relatively rare, thankfully, that this occurs, but we lost a district employee back on March 16th. That was Jamie Delgado. There was a memorial service scheduled shortly thereafter that not everybody, including myself, was able to attend because of other commitments. The family has announced that they're having a celebration of life ceremony Saturday, May 4th. It's an open house format, sort of a drop-in format, from 1 to 6 p.m. at Swiss Park. So I'll forward that information to you all, and just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And that's it from General Manager.
We're up to director's comments, our agenda item requests.
None?
No?
And none. Hearing no more further comments, and I'm going to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.